In a dark alley, a crying girl scrubbing the ground catches the attention of a cold, business-focused millionaire. As he gets closer, he notices something familiar in the child's eyes. A locket in her hands reveals an unexpected connection to his past. He decides to take her to his mansion, and what happens there will surprise you. The rain fell mercilessly over the opulent streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side, creating a somber symphony against the pavement. Alexander Richardson, one of New York's most influential business tycoons, walked through the downpour, his Italian leather shoes splashing through puddles with each determined step. The board meeting had been particularly exhausting, filled with tension and unspoken threats that seemed to hover in the air like invisible daggers. His mansion loomed ahead, a testament to his success, or perhaps to his loneliness. The wrought iron gates opened automatically as he approached, but something made him pause. A sound barely audible above the rain caught his attention. It came from the narrow alley beside his property, a space usually ignored by the wealthy residents of the neighborhood. Alexander turned, his expensive umbrella tilting slightly as he peered into the darkness. There, illuminated by the weak glow of a distant street lamp, was a sight that made his heart skip a beat. A small figure kneeling in the rain, scrubbing the dirty ground with what appeared to be a tattered rag. "Hello?" he called out, his voice, softer than usual, stripped of the commanding tone he typically used in boardrooms. The figure startled, revealing a young girl no more than 12 years old. Her clothes, soaked and worn, hung like heavy curtains on her thin frame. But it was her eyes that captured Alexander's attention, large, dark, and filled with a determination that seemed at odds with her desperate circumstances. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather," he said, taking a step closer. The girl immediately scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wet brick wall. "I'm not going to hurt you, let me help." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet, but the girl shook her head vigorously. Her hands clutched the dirty rag tighter, and Alexander noticed they were red and raw from the cold water. "Please," he tried again. "At least let me get you somewhere dry." The girl remained silent, but something in her expression shifted, fear mixed with uncertainty and perhaps a hint of hope. Alexander found himself transfixed by her presence, unable to walk away as he normally would. There was something hauntingly familiar about her face, something that tugged at memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Making a decision that would alter the course of both their lives, Alexander stepped closer, holding his umbrella over her. "My house is right there. You can get warm, have something to eat, and leave whenever you want. No questions asked." Minutes passed in silence, marked only by the steady drumming of rain. Finally, the girl stood, her movements cautious and deliberate. She kept the rag clutched in one hand, and Alexander noticed she had a small, weathered backpack slung over her shoulder. As they walked toward the mansion, Alexander felt an inexplicable sense of déjà vu. The way the girl moved, the slight tilt of her head as she glanced around, it all seemed to echo something from his past, a ghost of memories he couldn't quite grasp. The mansion's lights came on automatically as they approached, and for the first time Alexander could see the girl clearly. Her face was streaked with dirt, but underneath he could see delicate features that stirred something deep within his consciousness. Her dark hair, though matted and wet, fell in waves, similar to... He pushed the thought away. It couldn't be. That part of his life was gone, buried beneath years of focused ambition and calculated success. Yet as he opened the heavy wooden door and ushered the girl inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that this rainy night would unravel everything he'd built. Mrs. Reynolds, his housekeeper, appeared in the foyer, her eyes widening at the sight of the bedraggled child. Before she could speak, Alexander raised a hand. "Please prepare a hot bath and find some clean clothes, and bring some hot chocolate to the kitchen." The girl's eyes darted between them, then around the grand entrance hall, taking in the crystal chandelier, the sweeping staircase, the gleaming marble floors. She seemed both awed and terrified, clutching her backpack closer to her chest. "You're safe here," Alexander said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. He hadn't spoken to anyone that way since before the fire. "What's your name?" The girl looked at him for a long moment, her eyes seeming to search his soul. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. "Sarah," she said, and something in Alexander's world shifted imperceptibly, like the first tremor before an earthquake. He didn't know it then, but that simple introduction would be the key that would unlock a past he'd tried desperately to forget, leading him down a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, success, and redemption. As he watched Mrs. Reynolds lead Sarah upstairs, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen those eyes before, in a face he'd lost long ago. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Alexander's study, creating patterns on the rich mahogany desk where he sat, unable to focus on the documents before him. His thoughts kept drifting to the girl sleeping in one of the guest rooms upstairs. Sarah, the name echoed in his mind, stirring memories he'd locked away years ago. James Chen, his chief operating officer and closest confidant, sat across from him, his usual composed demeanor showing signs of concern. "Alex, the merger documents need your signature today. Are you listening?" Alexander blinked, forcing himself back to the present. "Yes, of course." He reached for his pen, but his hand froze as Mrs. Reynolds appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Richardson, the girl is awake. She's in the kitchen, but—" Mrs. Reynolds hesitated, wringing her hands. "She's refusing to eat unless she can clean something. First, says she needs to earn it." Alexander stood abruptly, causing James to raise an eyebrow. "We'll continue this later," he said, already moving toward the door. "Alex, the deadline?" James began. But Alexander was already gone, leaving his friend staring after him with an unreadable expression. In the kitchen, Sarah stood by the sink, her small frame nearly swallowed by the borrowed clothes Mrs. Reynolds had found for her. Her hair, now clean and brushed, fell in dark waves past her shoulders. She was holding a sponge, desperately trying to convince the cook to let her clean the already spotless counters. "Sarah," Alexander said softly, and she turned, those haunting eyes meeting his. In the morning light, the resemblance was even more striking. She could have been a younger version of Rachel, his sister, before the fire that took everything from him. "I need to work," she said, her voice stronger than the night before, but still carrying an edge of fear. "For the food, it's too much otherwise." She gestured to the plate of eggs and toast on the counter. Alexander approached slowly, as one might a wounded animal. "You don't need to earn your food here. It's freely given." Sarah's hands tightened on the sponge. "Nothing is free," she whispered, and the words carried the weight of hard-learned wisdom. "I always have to clean. It's the rule." "Whose rule?" Alexander asked, but Sarah pressed her lips together, refusing to answer. A flash of metal caught his eye, something hanging from a thin chain around her neck, partially hidden by the oversized sweater she wore. Without thinking, he took a step closer. "What's that?" Sarah's hand flew to her neck, gripping whatever hung from the chain. "It's mine," she said fiercely. "You can't take it. She gave it to me." "Who gave it to—" "You!" Alexander's heart was pounding now, though he couldn't explain why. Instead of answering, Sarah backed away, bumping into the counter. The movement caused the pendant to slip from her grasp, swinging free from beneath the sweater. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. It was a silver locket, antique and intricately carved with a pattern of roses. A locket he'd seen every day of his childhood, worn by his sister Rachel. A locket that should have been lost in the fire 15 years ago. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out hoarse, barely controlled. Sarah's eyes widened at his reaction, and she clutched the locket again. "I told you she gave it to me to keep me safe." "Who?" Alexander demanded, then immediately regretted his sharp tone as Sarah flinched. Before she could answer, James appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Alex, we have a situation. Harrison called. He's threatening to pull out of the merger unless you meet with him immediately." Alexander stood frozen, torn between the mystery unfolding before him and the business empire that demanded his attention. Sarah used the distraction to slip past him, disappearing through the other door with the speed and agility of someone used to making quick escapes. "Alex," James pressed, his voice urgent. "This could cost us millions." Alexander stared at the empty doorway where Sarah had vanished, his mind racing. That locket. It couldn't be a coincidence. But Richard Harrison's threats couldn't be ignored either. The merger represented years of careful planning, thousands of jobs hanging in the balance. "Tell Harrison I'm on my way," he said finally, straightening his tie. "Mrs. Reynolds, please make sure Sarah stays comfortable and call my investigator, discreetly." As he followed James out of the kitchen, Alexander's thoughts whirled. The locket, Sarah's familiar features, the timing of her appearance, it all meant something. And for the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to wonder if everything he'd believed about that terrible night might have been wrong. The meeting with Richard Harrison lasted longer than Alexander expected. The older businessman sat across from him in the private dining room of the Four Seasons, his silver hair immaculate, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "You seem distracted today, Alexander," Harrison observed, swirling his scotch. "Family troubles, perhaps?" Something in his tone made Alexander's spine stiffen. "Just focusing on the merger details. You mentioned concerns." "Ah, yes," Harrison pulled out a folder, sliding it across the polished table. "Your recent acquisitions in the Asian market. There are irregularities." Alexander's phone buzzed in his pocket, the third time in the past hour. He ignored it, focusing on the documents before him. The numbers didn't add up, showing discrepancies. That shouldn't exist. His department heads verified everything thoroughly before the merger talks began. "This is impossible," Alexander muttered, flipping through the pages. "These aren't our figures." Harrison's smile widened fractionally. "No? Perhaps you should talk to your COO about that. James Chen has been quite informative lately." The betrayal hit Alexander like a physical blow, but years of business negotiations kept his expression neutral. James had been with him for a decade, helping build the company from the ground up. They'd weathered countless crises together, shared victories and setbacks. The idea that he would... His phone buzzed again. This time, Alexander glanced at the screen. 4 missed calls from Mrs. Reynolds. A text message flashed, "Emergency, the girl, something's wrong." Alexander stood abruptly, gathering his papers. "We'll need to continue this another time." "Family emergency?" Harrison asked, that knowing smile still playing on his lips. "Give my regards to your little guest. Children can be so unpredictable." Alexander froze. "What did you say?" "Oh, word travels fast in our circles, Alexander. A wealthy bachelor suddenly taking in a street urchin. People talk. They wonder about motives, about past connections." Harrison stood, adjusting his perfectly tailored jacket. They might even start digging into old stories, about fires, about lost family members. "Stay away from her," Alexander warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Or what?" Harrison's facade of geniality disappeared. "You'll ruin me like you did my brother?" "Everything has a price, Alexander, even secrets." Alexander left without another word, his mind racing. In the car, he finally called Mrs. Reynolds back. Her voice was tense with worry. "Sir, I went to check on Sarah after lunch, but she was gone. We found her in the garden, sir, having some kind of panic attack. She keeps saying they found me over and over, and she's clutching that locket like her life depends on it." "I'm on my way," Alexander said, instructing his driver to hurry. "Don't let anyone near the house, no one." When he arrived home, he found Sarah huddled in the garden gazebo, her small frame shaking. Mrs. Reynolds hovered nearby, concern etched on her kind face. "Sarah?" Alexander approached slowly, remembering how she'd spooked in the kitchen. "You're safe here, no one can hurt you." She looked up at him, her eyes wild with fear. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They never stopped looking. She told me they wouldn't." "Who told you?" Alexander knelt beside her, his heart pounding. "The woman who gave you the locket." Sarah's hand tightened around the silver pendant. "I promised her I wouldn't tell. She said it would keep me safe. Until..." She trailed off, her gaze distant. "Until what, Sarah?" "Until I found the man in the picture." She hesitated, then with trembling fingers opened the locket. Inside was a faded photograph that Alexander knew all too well. Himself, 15 years younger, standing beside his sister Rachel, both smiling, unaware of the tragedy that would soon tear their world apart. "She said you'd protect me," Sarah whispered, "but she never said you were the one who needed the money." Alexander's blood ran cold. "What money?" "The money they said you took, the reason for the fire." Sarah's voice dropped even lower. "The reason she had to hide me." Before Alexander could process this revelation, his phone rang. James Chen's name flashed on the screen. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Alex, whatever Harrison told you, save it." Alexander cut him off. "We'll discuss your betrayal later. Right now I need everything you can find about the fire at my family's estate. Every document, every witness statement, every detail that was buried. And James, if you're really sorry, prove it. Find out who's been watching my house today." He ended the call, turning back to Sarah. She was staring at him with a mix of fear and desperate hope. "I don't understand any of this," Alexander admitted softly, "but I promise you we're going to figure it out together. No more running, no more hiding." Sarah nodded slowly, her grip on the locket finally loosening. "She said you'd say that. She said you were the only one who could make it right." In the distance, thunder rolled across the sky, promising another storm. But this time Alexander knew the real tempest would come from the secrets that had finally begun to surface after 15 years of silence. That evening, Alexander sat in his study, surrounded by old newspapers and documents that James had sent over. Sarah had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from the day's events, with Mrs. Reynolds keeping watch outside her door. The storm that had threatened all afternoon now raged outside, lightning occasionally illuminating the room in harsh bursts. He spread the yellowed newspaper clippings across his desk. The headlines screamed about the tragic fire that had destroyed the Richardson family estate, presuming his sister Rachel had perished in the flames. But now, with Sarah's words echoing in his mind, he began to see details he'd missed in his grief-stricken state 15 years ago. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting Mrs. Reynolds with another cup of coffee. Instead, Eleanor Martinez, his private investigator, stepped into the room. Her expression was grave. "You're not going to like what I found," she said without preamble. "Tell me." Eleanor placed a thick folder on his desk. "I did some digging into Harrison's activities around the time of the fire. His brother, Michael Harrison, was indeed ruined by your company's takeover, but there's more." She pulled out several documents. Michael Harrison had been embezzling money for years, using a complex network of offshore accounts. When your company's audit exposed his schemes, he lost everything. "I remember," Alexander said. "He disappeared afterward. Everyone assumed he'd fled the country." "That's what they wanted people to think," Elena's voice was grim. "But I found records of him checking into a private mental health facility just outside the city, under a different name. He stayed there until his passing 3 years ago. And guess who paid all his bills? Richard Harrison." "Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting." Elena pulled out a visitor log. Rachel visited him there multiple times in the months leading up to the fire. Alexander stood so quickly, his chair toppled backward. "That's impossible. Rachel never knew Michael Harrison. She knew him well enough to visit him 14 times in 3 months. Elena's expression softened. "There's more. The last visit was 2 days before the fire. And she wasn't alone. Security footage shows she had a child with her, a baby." The room seemed to spin. Alexander gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. "Sarah," he whispered, "the timing fits. Sarah would have been just a baby then." Eleanor hesitated. "Alexander, I think your sister was trying to protect someone. Not just the child, but Michael Harrison too. The question is, from what or whom?" Before Alexander could respond, Mrs. Reynolds burst into the study, her face pale. "Sir, come quickly. Sarah's having some kind of nightmare. She's speaking in her sleep, saying things." They rushed upstairs to find Sarah thrashing in her bed, tears streaming down her face even in sleep. "The papers," she muttered. "Have to keep the papers safe," Rachel said. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, gently shaking her awake. "Sarah, you're dreaming. You're safe." Her eyes flew open, wild with panic, before focusing on his face. recognition slowly dawned, followed by something else. Determination. She sat up, reaching for the backpack she refused to let anyone touch. "I remember now," she said, her voice stronger than he'd heard it yet. "She told me to keep them safe until I found you. Said you'd know what to do when the time was right." From the worn backpack, Sarah pulled out a plastic-wrapped bundle of papers, protected from the elements that had been her constant companions on the street. The papers were old but well-preserved, protected by their wrapping and Sarah's faithful guardianship. "She made me memorize where to find you," Sarah continued, her words tumbling out faster now. "Made me promise to wait until I was old enough to understand. Said I had to make sure you were still the same person she remembered, the one who always chose right over easy." Alexander took the bundle with trembling hands. As he unwrapped it, Eleanor leaned in, her investigator's instincts sharp. "Those are financial records," she said, scanning the documents, "and letters. Alexander, these are proof of something much bigger than Michael Harrison's embezzlement." "They're the reason," Sarah said quietly. "The reason she had to hide me. The reason she made me practice cleaning everything, so I could survive on the streets if I had to. She said people would pay anything to keep these papers buried." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark relief. In that brief, brilliant moment, Alexander saw something that made his heart stop. A signature at the bottom of one of the letters. Richard Harrison's name alongside a detailed plan that went far beyond simple corporate fraud. "All these years," Alexander breathed, "I thought I was protecting her memory by building the company bigger, stronger, but she was the one protecting all of us." Sarah reached out, touching the papers with reverent fingers. "She said you'd understand when you saw them. Said you'd know what to do." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw not just Rachel's features, but her strength. "Will you?" Alexander looked at the evidence in his hands, proof of crimes that could shake the foundations of the business world, proof that could ruin the Harrisons completely, proof that had cost his sister her freedom and forced her to hide her only daughter. "Yes," he said finally, "I know exactly what to do. But first you need to tell me everything you remember about Rachel. Every detail, every hiding place, every word she said. Because if these papers are what I think they are, she might still be out there, and she might still need our help." The dawn was breaking over Manhattan when Elena finally finished analyzing the documents Sarah had preserved for so long. The study had become a war room of sorts, with papers spread across every surface. Mrs. Reynolds kept a steady supply of coffee coming, her worried glances at Alexander growing more frequent as the hours passed. "It's incredible," Elena said, rubbing her tired eyes. "These records don't just prove Harrison's corruption. They show a pattern going back almost 20 years. Your sister wasn't just Michael Harrison's visitor. She was gathering evidence." Alexander stood by the window, watching the city come to life below. "She was always the clever one," he said softly. "While I was focused on building the business, she saw what was really happening." Sarah sat curled in a large leather armchair, her small frame almost disappearing into its depths. She'd refused to go back to sleep, insisting on being part of the conversation. Now she spoke up, her voice clear in the quiet room. "She used to write in a little blue notebook," Sarah said. "Every night, after she thought I was asleep. She would whisper things to herself, names and numbers." Eleanor's head snapped up. "A notebook? Do you know where it is?" Sarah shook her head, then paused. "But I remember where she used to hide things. There was a place, an old building, where we stayed sometimes. She had a special spot behind a loose brick." Alexander turned from the window. "Could you find it again?" "I think so. It was near the river in an old factory building with a red door. She called it our emergency home." Before Alexander could respond, his phone buzzed. James Chen's name flashed on the screen. After a moment's hesitation, he answered, putting it on speaker. "Alex, you need to hear this," James said, his voice urgent. "Harrison just called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. He's going to try to force a vote of no confidence, take control of the company." "He knows," Alexander said, meeting Eleanor's eyes. "Somehow he knows we have the documents." "There's more," James continued. "I did some digging like you asked. Someone's been accessing old files about the fire going back months. Not just the public records, but the sealed investigation files. They used my security clearance to do it. Alexander's jaw tightened. And you're just telling me this now? I swear I didn't know. My assistant, Peter Walsh, he had access to my codes. I just found out he's been working with Harrison for over a year. Alex, they're not just after the company. They're looking for something specific about that night. Sarah suddenly stood, her face pale. The basement, she whispered. Mom always said if anything happened to remember the basement. What basement? Elena asked gently. At the old house where the fire was. She said there was something hidden. There, something that would explain everything. But we could never go back because they were watching. Alexander exchanged looks with Elena. The ruins of his family estate had been sold years ago, developed into luxury condominiums, but the original foundation remained. James, Alexander said into the phone, I need one more thing from you. Get me the original architectural plans for my family's house. And James, if you're playing both sides here. I'm not, James interrupted. I know I messed up, but I'm trying to make it right. The plans will be in your inbox in an hour. After hanging up, Alexander turned to Elena. How quickly can you get us access to that construction site? Give me 2 hours, she replied, already, pulling out her phone. But Alexander, if we do this, if we go digging around that site, Harrison will know. He's obviously had it watched all these years. Good, Alexander said, his voice hard. Let him know. While he's focused on us there, Mrs. Reynolds will take Sarah to check that old factory building. No, Sarah jumped up. I want to stay with you. She said we had to stick together once I found you. Alexander knelt before her chair. Sarah, listen to me. Your mother spent years protecting you, keeping you safe. I need you to help me understand why. That notebook might tell us where she is now, but we have to split up to find all the answers. Sarah's lower lip trembled, but she straightened her shoulders, a gesture so reminiscent of Rachel that it made Alexander's heart ache. She also said you were stubborn, she said, that once you made up your mind, nothing could change it. A ghost of a smile crossed Alexander's face. She was right about that. Mrs. Reynolds will keep you safe, I promise. As preparations were made, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. From his study window, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted. Let them watch, he thought. After 15 years of running from the truth, it was time to face it head-on. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, in a small apartment across town, a woman with familiar dark hair was also watching. On her table lay a newspaper with Alexander's picture, the headline announcing his company's troubled merger. And in her hand, she held a locket identical to Sarah's, her fingers tracing the rose pattern as tears slid down her cheeks. The old factory building loomed before them, its red door faded to a rusty brown. Mrs. Reynolds parked the car in a secluded spot, her experienced eyes scanning the area for any signs of surveillance. Sarah pressed her face against the window, memories flooding back. It looks smaller, she whispered. But the door's the same. She always said to remember the red door. Meanwhile, across town, Alexander and Eleanor approached the construction site of what used to be his family estate. The foundation work for the new development was in full swing, with workers bustling around the excavated basement area. The foreman's been paid to take an extended lunch break, Elena murmured. We have 30 minutes. Alexander nodded, his eyes fixed on the exposed foundation walls. Somewhere down there, Rachel had hidden something important enough to protect with her life, something worth abandoning everything for. Back at the factory, Sarah led Mrs. Reynolds through a maze of empty corridors, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. The building smelled of rust and abandonment, but Sarah moved with the confidence of muscle memory. Here, she said suddenly, stopping before a section of wall. Behind this brick. She pointed to one that looked identical to all the others, but when Mrs. Reynolds pressed it, it moved slightly. At the construction site, Alexander and Elena descended into the basement. The original foundation walls were still visible beneath. The new construction markings. Alexander ran his hands along the rough surface, remembering. Rachel used to play hide and seek down here, he said softly. She knew every corner, every hidden space. Eleanor consulted the old blueprints on her tablet. The plans show an unusual gap behind this section of wall. It could be structural or a hiding place, Alexander finished, already moving to examine the area. In the factory, Sarah and Mrs. Reynolds carefully removed the loose brick. Behind it was a small cavity, and inside, wrapped in plastic similar to what had protected the documents, was a blue notebook. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. "It's her writing," she breathed. "Look, there are dates, names." Mrs. Reynolds peered at the pages. "My dear," she gasped, "some of these entries are from just a few months ago." Alexander and Elena had found something too, a metal box sealed and rusted, hidden in a gap between the old foundation walls. It took both of them to work it free. "We need to get this somewhere safe before we open it," Elena said, checking her watch. "The workers will be back soon." As they climbed out of the basement, Alexander's phone rang. It was Mrs. Reynolds. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking with excitement, "we found something, the notebook. It's not just old evidence, she's been updating it. Rachel's alive and she's been in the city." Alexander gripped the phone tighter. "What else does it say?" "There are addresses, meeting times, and sir, there's an entry for today. She knew we'd find this." "What does it say?" Before Mrs. Reynolds could answer, Sarah's voice came through in the background, reading from the notebook. "When the truth comes out, the answers will be at the beginning, where it all started, where the first lies were told." Alexander's mind raced. The beginning. Suddenly he knew. "The old bank," he said. "Harrison's original bank where Michael worked. The building's abandoned now, but it's still standing." "Sir," Mrs. Reynolds said urgently, "there's more. The last entry, it's addressed to you directly. It says, 'Alex, if you're reading this, bring the box from the basement. It's time to finish what we started.'" Alexander looked at the metal box in Elena's arms, then at his watch. The board meeting was in 3 hours. Harrison would be gathering his allies, preparing to take everything Alexander had built. "Mrs. Reynolds, take Sarah to the safe house we discussed. Elena and I will handle this." "No," Sarah's voice came through clearly. "The notebook says we all have to be there. The truth needs all its guardians present." That's what she wrote. "Please, I need to see her." Alexander closed his eyes, remembering Rachel's words from so long ago. Sometimes the hardest choice and the right choice are the same thing. "The old bank," he said finally. 1 hour. But at the first sign of trouble, Mrs. Reynolds, you get her out of there. No arguments." As they ended the call, Elena touched his arm. "Alexander, this could be a trap." "Of course it is," he replied, starting toward the car. "But it's also our only chance to understand what really happened 15 years ago, why Rachel ran, why she hid Sarah, and what was so important that the Harrisons would destroy an entire family to keep it secret. What none of them knew was that they weren't the only ones heading to the old bank." In her apartment, the woman with the matching locket closed her notebook and picked up her car keys. After 15 years of waiting, of watching from the shadows, it was time to face the past. Time to reveal the truth that had cost her everything, and might be the only thing that could save them all. The old Harrison National Bank building stood like a forgotten sentinel in the heart of the financial district, its once proud facade now weathered by time and neglect. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the surrounding skyscrapers, creating an ethereal atmosphere around the abandoned structure. Alexander and Elena arrived first, parking their car in an alley behind the building. The metal box from the basement sat heavy in Alexander's hands as they surveyed the entrance. "Security cameras are still active," Elena noted, checking her tablet. "Someone's maintaining them." "Harrison," Alexander said. "He never fully abandoned this place. The question is why?" His phone buzzed, a message from James. "Board members are gathering early. Harrison's telling them you've had a mental breakdown, using the girl as evidence of unstable behavior. You need to get back here." Alexander switched off the phone. The company he'd spent 15 years building might crumble tonight. But for the first time since the fire, it didn't seem to matter as much. Mrs. Reynolds' car pulled up quietly beside them. Sarah practically jumped out before the vehicle had fully stopped, her eyes wide as she took in the building. The blue notebook was clutched tightly to her chest. "This is it," she whispered. "I've seen this place before, in my dreams." She used to tell me stories about it. Alexander knelt beside her. What kind of stories? About secret rooms, hidden places where bad men kept their lies. Sarah's voice took on a distant quality, as if reciting from memory. She said the truth was buried in the walls, waiting for the right time to come out. Eleanor's tablet suddenly beeped. Movement inside, 3rd floor, moving toward the main stairwell. Alexander's heart raced. Could it be Rachel? Or was Harrison already here, waiting to spring his trap? "Mrs. Reynolds, take Sarah back to the car," he started, but Sarah cut him off. "No, Mum's notebook says we all have to be here. Look." She opened the notebook to the last page, where Rachel's familiar handwriting flowed across the paper. "The circle must be complete. The truth needs all its witnesses. Alex, Sarah, Elena, Margaret Reynolds, each plays a part. Together we end this, or it never ends." "Mrs. Reynolds," Margaret gasped. "She knew I'd be here, after all these years." Alexander stared at his longtime housekeeper. "Margaret, what aren't you telling us?" The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "Say, I used to help Rachel back then, passing messages, keeping watch. The night of the fire, she came to me first, made me promise to be ready, to help when the time came. I've been waiting ever since." Before anyone could respond to this revelation, movement caught their eye. A figure appeared briefly in one of the upper windows, a woman with dark hair. Sarah grabbed Alexander's hand. "It's her," she whispered. "I can feel it." Eleanor checked her tablet again. More movement. Multiple signals now. We're not alone here. Alexander made a decision. "We go in together. Margaret, stay close to Sarah. Eleanor, watch our backs. Whatever happens, whatever we find in there, we face it as a family." He looked at Sarah. "That's what Rachel wanted, isn't it? To bring the family back together." Sarah nodded, her small face set with determination. "She said you'd understand. When the time came, that you'd remember what you promised her the day I was born." Alexander's mind flashed back 15 years to a quiet hospital room, Rachel holding a tiny bundle, making him swear an oath. "Promise me, Alex, that if anything ever happens, you'll choose love over power. Promise me you'll protect what really matters." He hadn't understood then. The ambitious young businessman couldn't grasp what she'd been trying to tell him. But now, standing in the shadow of his past with his niece's hand in his, the truth of her words finally reached him. "Let's go," he said, leading them toward the entrance. "It's time to keep that promise." As they approached the heavy doors, Sarah suddenly stopped, pulling something from her pocket. A key, old and brass, attached to a faded ribbon. "She gave me this the last time I saw her," Sarah said. "Said I'd know when to use it." The key slid perfectly into the lock. Inside, the bank's grand lobby was a study in faded elegance. Dust motes danced in the beams of light streaming through the high windows, and their footsteps echoed on the marble floor. The metal box in Alexander's hands seemed to grow heavier with each step. At the foot of the main staircase, Sarah stopped again, her face tilted as if listening. "She's here," she whispered, "and she's not alone." From somewhere above came the sound of a door closing, followed by footsteps, multiple sets moving in different directions. Alexander tightened his grip on Sarah's hand. In his other arm, the box from the basement held secrets that had torn his family apart. Now, in this forgotten temple of finance, those same secrets might finally bring them back together, or tear apart everything all over again. The ascent through the old bank building felt like climbing through layers of the past. Each floor held its own shadows, its own whispered secrets. Elena led the way, her tablet tracking the movements. Above them, while Margaret brought up the rear, her years of quiet vigilance evident in her alert posture. Sarah's grip on Alexander's hand never wavered. She moved with surprising confidence, as if she'd walked these halls before, perhaps in the stories Rachel had told her, or in dreams that were more than dreams. They reached the 3rd floor, landing when Elena held up her hand, stopping them. "Multiple heat signatures in the main office area," she whispered. "At least 4 people." 5, Sarah corrected softly. "Mom always said to count the shadows, not just the lights." Alexander was about to ask what she meant when they heard it. A voice he'd know anywhere, though it was deeper, rougher than he remembered. "It's time, Richard. No more games." Rachel. Sarah started forward, but Alexander held her back, pressing a finger to his lips. They crept closer to the partially open doors of what had once been the bank's executive suite. Through the gap, they could see Rachel standing by the windows, her back to the door. She'd cut her hair short, but her stance was unchanged, the same quiet strength Alexander remembered. Richard Harrison sat behind the massive desk that had once belonged to his father, his usual polished appearance somewhat diminished by tension. "Games?" Harrison's laugh was brittle. "You're the one who's been playing games, Rachel. 15 years of hide-and-seek. And for what? These precious documents you've been collecting? The evidence that was supposed to bring down my family's empire? You know it was never about bringing down your empire." Rachel's voice was steady. "It was about justice for everyone you and your father destroyed, including your own brother." A third voice joined the conversation, James Chen stepping out from the shadows. "She's right, Richard. I've seen the evidence. What your father did and what you helped cover up, it goes beyond corporate fraud." Harrison's face contorted with rage. "You're both fools. You think these papers, these secrets matter. I own half. The judges in this city. I have politicians in my pocket. In an hour I'll own your brother's company too, and then what?" Alexander pushed the door open fully, stepping into the room with Sarah still holding his hand. "You'll bury the truth again? Like you buried it 15 years ago?" The look on Harrison's face would have been comical under other circumstances. Shock giving way to calculation, giving way to fear, as his eyes fell on Sarah. Rachel turned, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Her eyes filled with tears as she saw her daughter, but she didn't move, didn't break her stance. "Hello, Alex," she said softly. "You got my messages?" "Mom?" Sarah's voice quavered, but she stood her ground. Rachel's composure cracked slightly. "My brave girl, you did everything perfectly, just like we practiced." Harrison's hand moved toward his desk drawer, but Elena was faster, stepping into the room with her tablet raised. "I wouldn't," she said. "This entire conversation is being streamed to secure servers, along with copies of everything Rachel's collected. And everything in here," Alexander added, finally setting down the metal box he'd carried from the basement. "The original evidence, isn't it, Rachel? What Michael Harrison tried to expose before your father silenced him?" Rachel nodded. "Michael was a good man in the end. He tried to make it right, tried to expose what his father had done. The lives ruined, the families destroyed, all to build this empire of lies." She looked at Harrison. "Your father didn't just silence him, he broke him, made his own son think he was crazy, locked him away, just like you've been trying to do to Alex." "You don't understand," Harrison snarled. "We built this city. My father's methods might have been harsh, but he created thousands of jobs, supported countless families." "By destroying others," Margaret spoke up from the doorway, her quiet voice carrying unexpected authority. "I was there, Mr. Harrison. I saw what your father did to those who stood in his way, how many lives he ruined, how many children he left without parents." Sarah stepped forward, still holding Alexander's hand but standing straighter. "Like my father?" The room fell silent. Rachel's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Michael Harrison was your father, wasn't he?" Alexander asked softly, finally understanding. "That's why you visited him in the facility, why you gathered evidence all those years. You were trying to help him remember the truth." Rachel nodded. "We fell in love while I was investigating the corruption. He wanted to make things right, to stop his father. But when he threatened to go public," she trailed off, pain etching her features. "They orchestrated his breakdown," James finished. "I found the records, drugged him, manipulated his memories, made him think he was paranoid. By the time Rachel realized she was pregnant, it was too late. They were watching her too." Harrison stood, his facade of control crumbling. "You have no idea what it's like living in his shadow. Everything I did to protect our legacy." "Your legacy is built on suffering," Rachel cut him off. "But it ends today." She turned to Alexander. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything back then, sorry I had to run. But I knew someday you'd find Sarah, and when you did, The truth would finally come out, Alexander finished. He reached for the metal box, but before he could open it, a new sound echoed through the building. Sirens growing closer. Harrison's smile returned, triumphant. "Did you really think I came here alone? The police are on their way, and who do you think they'll believe? The respected businessman, or the mentally ill woman who's been stalking his family? The corporate CEO, or the unstable brother who took in a street child on a whim?" But Sarah was smiling too, a smile so like her mother's it made Alexander's heart ache. "Mom," she said, "should we show him what else was in your notebook?" Rachel reached into her jacket, pulling out a phone. "5th floor security office. Live streaming everything. Just like you taught me, Alex, always have a backup plan." She pressed a button, and Harrison's face went pale as his own voice filled the room, confessing to years of crimes. The sirens grew louder, but now they carried a different meaning. The truth, hidden for so long in the walls of this old bank, was finally breaking free. And as Sarah finally ran to Rachel's arms, Alexander understood what his sister had known all along, that some treasures were worth more than all the wealth in the world, and some families were bound by something stronger than blood or power. They were bound by truth. The next hour passed in a blur of flashing lights and official statements. The old bank building, so long a vault of secrets, now buzzed with activity as federal agents collected evidence and took statements. Harrison had been escorted out in handcuffs, his carefully crafted facade finally crumbling under the weight of truth. In a quiet corner of what had once been the bank's employee lounge, Rachel sat with Sarah curled against her side, neither willing to let go of the other. Alexander watched them from the doorway, his heart full of emotions he couldn't quite name. "She has your smile," he said softly, entering the room. "I should have seen it sooner." Rachel looked up, her eyes bright with tears and relief. "I wanted to tell you everything, Alex. So many times I almost came back. Why didn't you? Because I knew you'd try to fight them head on. You'd have gone straight at Harrison and his father." She shuddered. "They wouldn't have hesitated to hurt you too. I couldn't risk that, not after what they did to Michael." Sarah stirred, looking up at her mother. "Is Dad really... is he still alive?" Rachel's arms tightened around her daughter. "No, sweetheart. The treatments they forced on him, the drugs they used to keep him, confused and afraid. His heart couldn't take it, but he loved you so much. Even in his darkest moments, he never forgot that." Elena appeared in the doorway, her tablet tucked under her arm. "The federal agents want to talk to Rachel again. And Alexander, the board. Members are blowing up your phone. The news about Harrison is spreading fast." Alexander waved her concern away. "Let them wait. There's something more important we need to do first." He picked up the metal box from where it sat on a nearby table. "Sarah kept her part of the mission safe all these years. It's time we saw what you protected, Rachel." Rachel nodded gently, shifting Sarah so she could stand. "Michael began collecting evidence years before I met him. Bank records, property deeds, insurance documents, proof of how Harrison Sr. built his empire by destroying others. When Michael started remembering, started fighting the drugs they'd given him, he knew they'd try to silence him permanently." She took the box from Alexander, her fingers tracing the rusted edges. "He gave me this the last time I saw him, the day before." She swallowed hard. "He said it was his gift to his child, the truth that would set everyone free." The box's lock had corroded over the years, but Elena produced a small toolkit, and together they carefully worked it open. Inside, preserved in plastic, lay a stack of documents, photographs, and a letter in Michael's handwriting. "My dearest child," Rachel read, her voice trembling. "If you're reading this, then the truth has finally come to light. I wish I could have been there to see it, to hold you and tell you how much I love you. But know that everything I did, everything your mother did, was to give you a chance at a world where truth matters more than power." Sarah reached for the letter, her small fingers touching her father's handwriting reverently. "He knew about me?" "He knew," Rachel whispered. "When I told him I was pregnant, it gave him the strength to fight back against the drugs, to remember who he really was. That's when his father..." She couldn't finish. Alexander put his arm around his sister's shoulders, And that's when you knew you had to run, to protect Sarah, and to finish what Michael started. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. James Chen appeared, looking both excited and anxious. "Alex, you need to see this. The federal agents found a hidden room in the basement, Harrison's personal vault. There are files going back decades. Names, dates, everything Rachel and Michael were trying to prove. The truth about all the families they hurt," Sarah asked, looking up from her father's letter. James nodded. "And more. The agents say it's enough to unravel the entire Harrison empire. Every corrupt deal, every person they destroyed. It's all there." Rachel sagged against Alexander, years of tension finally releasing. "It's really over," she breathed. "Michael can rest now. All those families can finally have justice. But what about us?" Sarah's voice was small but clear. "What happens now?" Alexander looked at his sister, at the niece he'd only just found, at the family he'd thought lost forever. In the distance, he could hear the city waking up to a new day, a day where old lies would finally face the light of truth. "Now," he said, pulling them both into an embrace, "we do what families are supposed to do. We build something new together, something built on truth and love, not power and fear." Mrs. Reynolds appeared with cups of hot chocolate, a comfort from Sarah's first night at the mansion that already felt like a lifetime ago. As they sat together, sharing the warmth and the moment, a plan began to form in Alexander's mind. A way to honor Michael's memory, to help all the families the Harrisons had hurt, and to build the kind of legacy Rachel had always believed in. But first, they had healing to do. And as he watched Sarah drifting to sleep against Rachel's shoulder, her father's letter still clutched in her hand, Alexander knew that the greatest wealth he'd ever have was right here in this room. 1 month after the revelations at the old bank, Alexander's mansion had transformed from a symbol of solitary success into a home filled with life and purpose. The grand study, once a fortress of business deals, now served as a command center for a different kind of mission. Rachel sat at the massive desk, surrounded by files and photographs, while Elena worked nearby, coordinating with a team of investigators. They were piecing together the stories of every family affected by the Harrisons' crimes, creating a comprehensive plan for restitution. Sarah had taken over a corner of the room, setting up what she called her hope board, a large cork board where she pinned photos and stories of the families they were helping. She'd inherited her father's eye for detail and her mother's determination to make things right. "Look at this one," she called out, holding up a newspaper clipping. "The Martinez family lost their bakery 20 years ago. They still have the original recipes." Alexander paused in the doorway, watching his niece's enthusiasm. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Sarah's face lit up. "We could help them start. Again, there's that empty storefront in the building you just bought. The one we're converting into the community center," Rachel added, smiling. "It would be perfect for a family bakery." The community center had been Alexander's first major project since restructuring his company. The building, located in the heart of the area where many of Harrison's victims had once lived, was being transformed into a place of hope and new beginnings. Mrs. Reynolds entered with a tray of tea and cookies, a new tradition for their afternoon strategy sessions. "The contractor called," she announced. "The renovations are ahead of schedule, and the legal aid office can move in next month." "Perfect timing," Eleanor said, looking up from her tablet. "I just got confirmation. 10 more families have come forward with evidence of Harrison's manipulation. They'll need legal support to reclaim what they lost." Alexander moved to the window, looking out at the city he'd once viewed solely as a battlefield for business conquest. Now he saw it differently, as a community of interconnected lives, each with its own story of struggle and resilience. "I had a call from the board this morning," he said, turning back to his family. "They've unanimously approved the restructuring plan. 30% of all company profits will go directly to the restoration fund." Rachel joined him at the window, slipping her arm through his. "Michael would be so proud of this. It's exactly what he wanted, using the truth to heal instead of harm." "Dad's letter said that," Sarah piped up, pulling the now familiar paper from her pocket. She carried it everywhere, this tangible connection to the father she'd never known. "Truth without compassion is just another form of power," she read aloud. A knock at the door interrupted them. James Chen entered, carrying a large envelope. Since the revelation of Harrison's crimes, he'd worked tirelessly to help identify and contact affected families, his way of atoning for his unwitting role in Harrison's schemes. "The first applications for the scholarship program are in," he announced. 20 children from families Harrison hurt, all wanting to study law or social justice. They're calling it the Michael Harrison Memorial Scholarship, turning his name into a force for good. Sarah jumped up from her corner. "Can I help read the applications? Mom says I have good judgment about people." Rachel laughed, the sound still new and precious in the house that had known too much silence. "You certainly saw through Uncle Alex's grumpy facade right away." "I was not grumpy," Alexander protested, but he was smiling too. "I was professionally focused." "You were scared," Sarah said simply, with the directness only children can manage. "Just like I was. But Mom always says being scared is okay, so as long as you don't let it stop you from doing what's right." The wisdom in her words struck them all silent for a moment. This child, who had carried such heavy secrets for so long, had somehow maintained the ability to see truth clearly and speak it with love. Mrs. Reynolds wiped a tear from her eye. "Speaking of doing what's right, don't you have a presentation to prepare for, young lady? The center's opening ceremony is next week." Sarah straightened her shoulders, suddenly looking so much like both her parents that it made Alexander's heart ache. "I'm ready. I'm going to tell everyone how one person's courage to tell the truth can change everything. How love is stronger than fear. And how family," Rachel added softly, "can be lost and found and built again, as many times as it takes." Alexander looked around the room, at his sister, finally free to be herself again, at his niece blossoming in the light of truth and love, at the loyal friends who had become family. The empire he'd spent 15 years building had transformed into something far more valuable than he'd ever imagined. Outside, the city hummed with life and possibility. Inside, in this room that had become the heart of their mission, a different kind of wealth was growing. The wealth of restored lives, of justice served with compassion, of family bonds strengthened by shared purpose. And in every face, in every story they helped rewrite, Michael Harrison's legacy lived on. Not as a casualty of corporate greed, but as the spark that lit a flame of truth that would never again be extinguished. The day before the community center's grand opening dawned bright and clear. Alexander stood in the main hall, surveying the space that had been transformed from an abandoned building into a beacon of hope. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed skylights, illuminating the freshly painted walls adorned with local artists' murals depicting stories of community and renewal. Sarah darted past him, her arms full of handmade welcome signs she'd created with other children from affected families. Over the past month, she'd become the heart of the project, insisting on being involved in every detail, from the color schemes to the program planning. "Uncle Alex," she called out, skidding to a stop, "can you help me hang these? I want them to be perfect for tomorrow." As they worked together, Rachel entered the hall, deep in conversation with Eleanor about the security arrangements for the opening ceremony. They expected hundreds of attendees, including many families coming forward for the first time. "The Martinez family just confirmed," Elena reported, checking her tablet. "They're bringing their grandmother's original recipe book. The kitchen installation team is staying late tonight to make sure the bakery space is ready for them to start next week." Rachel smiled, watching Sarah direct Alexander on the precise placement of each sign. "It's amazing how much she's changed," she said softly. "A month ago, she was still jumping at shadows, afraid to trust anyone. Now look at her." Indeed, Sarah had blossomed in ways none of them had expected. The girl who once cleaned compulsively to feel safe now channeled that energy into organizing community programs. Her experience on the streets had given her unique insight into what people really needed. "Mom," Sarah called out, "can we show Uncle Alex the special room now? It's finally ready." Rachel exchanged a knowing look with Elena. "I suppose it's time. Alex, would you come with us?" They led him down a corridor to a room he hadn't been allowed to see during construction, Sarah bounced excitedly as Rachel unlocked the door. Inside, Alexander found himself in a warm, welcoming space filled with photographs and memorabilia. One wall held a timeline of the Harrison case, but not focused on the crimes. Instead, it showcased the strength of the families who had fought back, including vintage photos of Michael Harrison in happier times. "It's the memory wall," Sarah explained proudly, "so people can see that even when bad things happen, good people can come together and make things right again." Alexander's throat tightened as he spotted a central photo, Rachel and Michael, on their wedding day, young and in love before everything fell apart. Beside it hung Sarah's cherished letter from her father, carefully preserved behind glass. "There's more," Rachel said gently, guiding him to another section. There, he found photos of their own family from before the fire, holidays, birthdays, ordinary moments made precious by time and loss. And at the center, a recent photo of the three of them with Mrs. Reynolds and Elena, taken during one of their afternoon strategy sessions. "It's not just about the past," Sarah explained, slipping her hand into his. "It's about how we make new memories too, how we become stronger." Mrs. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, dabbing at her eyes with her ever-present handkerchief. "The caterers are here for the final menu tasting," she announced. "And Sarah, dear, the children from the art program are asking for you. They need help with the welcome packets." Sarah hugged Alexander quickly before darting off, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Rachel watched her go with a mixture of pride and amazement. "Sometimes I still can't believe we're here," she admitted. "All those years of hiding, of watching from a distance, afraid to reach out, and now look what she's helping create." Alexander put his arm around his sister. "Michael would be proud of both of you. And speaking of which," he pulled an envelope from his jacket. "The first round of scholarship recipients has been chosen. 20 students who'll carry his legacy forward, studying law and social justice." Rachel took the envelope with trembling hands. "I never thought his name would become something positive in this city again, that his story would inspire hope instead of fear." Through the windows, they could see more families arriving, bringing donations for the center's various programs. The Martinez family's teenage son was helping unload baking equipment, while his grandmother supervised carefully, her precious recipe book clutched to her chest. "It's more than a community center," Elena observed, joining them. "It's becoming a symbol of what's possible when people choose truth over power, love over fear." Alexander watched as Sarah reappeared in the main hall, now surrounded by a group of children her age, all working together on welcome packets. Her laughter floated up to them, free and unguarded. "When she first showed up in that alley, he said quietly, I thought I was the one doing the rescuing. I never imagined she'd end up saving all of us." Rachel squeezed his hand. "That's the thing about family, isn't it? We save each other, over and over again, in all the ways that matter." Outside, the sun was setting on their final day of preparation. Tomorrow the doors would open to the public, and their private journey of healing would become part of something much bigger. But for now, in this room filled with memories both old and new, they simply stood together, grateful for second chances and the infinite ways love finds to rebuild what was broken. The morning of the grand opening, Sarah stood before her mirror, carefully adjusting the blue ribbon in her hair, the same shade as the notebook that had helped bring her family back together. She could hear the excited bustle of activity downstairs in the mansion as final preparations were made. "Ready, sweetheart." Rachel appeared in the doorway, looking elegant in a simple navy dress. "Your speech cards are all set." Sarah shook her head, touching the locket around her neck. "I don't need them anymore. Dad's letter says to speak from the heart, and that's what I'm going to do." Downstairs, Alexander paced the foyer, reviewing last-minute details with Elena, while Mrs. Reynolds coordinated with the transportation team. They'd arranged buses to bring families from all over the city, ensuring everyone who wanted to attend could make it. "The press is already gathering," Elena reported, checking her tablet. "And James called. The first group of scholarship recipients is on their way. Are you sure about letting Sarah speak first?" Alexander smiled, thinking of his niece's quiet determination. She's been preparing for this moment her whole life, even if she didn't know it. This is her story to tell. When they arrived at the center, the street was already filled with people. The Martinez family had set up their bakery. Counter in the entrance hall, the smell of fresh bread and hope filling the air. Children darted about, wearing t-shirts with the center's logo. A rising sun over clasped hands, designed by Sarah herself. In the main hall, Sarah stood on tiptoe, peeking through the curtain at the gathering crowd. Families filled the rows of chairs, some clutching photos of their own, others holding hands and whispering encouragement to each other. She recognized faces from her research, stories she'd helped piece together. "Quite a crowd out there," James said softly, joining them backstage. He'd become a regular presence at the center, finding his own redemption in helping others rebuild their lives. The scholarship students are all wearing blue ribbons. They wanted to honor Michael's memory. Rachel touched her daughter's shoulder. "Are you nervous?" Sarah took a deep breath, looking around at her family. Her mother, who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe. Her uncle, who had opened his heart and his home when she needed it most. Mrs. Reynolds, who had kept faith all those years. Elena and James, who had helped bring the truth to light. "No," she said firmly, "I'm ready." Alexander stepped forward to open the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Welcome to the Michael Harrison Memorial Community Center. This place represents more than just a building. It represents the triumph of truth over deception, of love over fear, and most importantly, the power of family in all its forms." When he introduced Sarah, the audience's supportive applause wrapped around her like a warm embrace. She walked to the podium, her head high, her father's letter tucked safely in her pocket. "A month ago," she began, her clear voice silencing the hall. "I was a girl cleaning streets to survive, carrying secrets I didn't fully understand. Today, I stand here because one person chose to stop and see me, really see me. And that choice started a chain reaction of truth and love that brought us all here today." She told their story, not just her family's, but the story of every person in the room who had suffered under the Harrison Empire's corruption. She spoke about her father's courage in trying to expose the truth, about her mother's love that kept her safe, about her uncle's willingness to open his heart. "This center isn't just about helping people," she continued, gesturing to the memory wall visible through the open doors. "It's about remembering that every person has value, every story matters, and it's never too late to start again." As she spoke, something remarkable happened. People in the audience began standing up, calling out their own stories, their own moments of connection. The Martinez grandmother held up her recipe book, explaining how her family's legacy would live on in the center's kitchen. Scholarship recipients shared their dreams of using their education to protect others from injustice. Rachel watched from the wings, tears streaming down her face as her daughter brought the room together, turning individual stories of loss into a tapestry of shared hope. Alexander stood beside her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "She's exactly like him," Rachel whispered. "Michael always believed in the power of honest words to heal." Sarah concluded by unfolding her father's letter, her voice strong and clear as she read the final lines. "Truth without compassion is just another form of power, but truth with love can rebuild worlds. This is my gift to you, the courage to stand in the light and help others find their way there too." As the applause thundered through the hall, Sarah looked back at her family. In that moment, they all felt it, the presence of Michael Harrison, not as a tragic figure but as a source of inspiration that would touch countless lives through the work of this center. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, streaming through the skylights and illuminating the hall in a warm glow. New beginnings, Sarah had learned, could happen at any moment. All it took was one person brave enough to stop, to see, to care. And now in this place built from truth and love, those new beginnings would multiply, rippling out to touch lives they hadn't even imagined yet. 3 months after the grand opening, the Michael Harrison Memorial Community Center had become a buzzing hub of activity and hope. The once empty building now pulsed with life from dawn to dusk, each room telling its own story of renewal and recovery. In the bustling kitchen of the Martinez family bakery, Sophia Martinez stood beside her grandmother, carefully learning the secret fold that made their signature pastries so special. The aroma of fresh bread and warm memories filled the air as customers lined up, drawn as much by the family's story of resilience as by their legendary recipes. "Abuela," Sophia called out, "Sarah's here for her lesson." Indeed, Sarah had made it her mission to learn from every family that came through the center's doors. She slipped on an apron, her face lighting up as Mrs. Martinez began explaining the importance of measuring ingredients with your heart as well as your hands. Meanwhile, in the center's legal aid office, Elena sat with James, reviewing a new batch of cases. The wall behind them displayed framed law school acceptance letters from the first group of Michael Harrison's scholars. "Another family came forward this morning," Eleanor reported, adding a file to their growing stack. "They lost their home to one of Harrison Sr.'s development schemes in the 90s. Their documentation is incredible. They kept everything." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know what's remarkable? Every family that comes forward brings not just their own story, but connections to others who were affected. It's like uncovering a map of how many lives were touched by this." In the main hall, Rachel led a support group session, creating a safe space for families to share their experiences of rebuilding. The room had been arranged in a circle, emphasizing that everyone's story held equal importance. "When I was in hiding," Rachel shared, her voice gentle but strong, "I used to dream of a place where truth could be spoken without fear, where healing could happen not in isolation, but in community. Looking at all of you today, I realized that dream wasn't just mine, it belonged to all of us." Alexander, observing from the doorway, felt a profound sense of rightness. His company's boardroom had never given him the satisfaction he found in watching these families reclaim their dignity and strength. Sarah appeared at his side, Flower, still dusting her hands from her baking lesson. "Uncle Alex, come see what we're planning for the youth program." She led him to a room where a group of teenagers, children of families affected by the Harrisons' actions, were designing a mentorship program. Their energy and creativity filled the space with possibility. "We're calling it Phoenix Rising," Sarah explained proudly, "because it's about helping kids turn hard experiences into strength, like how cleaning helped me survive. But now I can use that skill to organize and help others." One of the teens, Maria Martinez, Sophia's older sister, stepped forward with a presentation board. "We want to match kids with training in whatever interests them: art, business, cooking, law, anything that can help them build a future." Alexander studied their plans, impressed by the thoughtfulness behind them. "This goes beyond what we initially imagined for the center," he said. "That's the point," Sarah replied, with the wisdom that still sometimes caught him off guard. "Mom says healing isn't just about fixing what was broken, it's about creating something new and better." Later that afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds organized a celebration for the first successful business launch, supported by the center's entrepreneurship program. A young woman who had lost her family's educational toy store to Harrison's manipulations was reopening with a modern twist, combining traditional toys with educational technology. "Every success story here creates ripples," Mrs. Reynolds observed, watching the celebration. "Each person who heals helps others believe in their own healing." As evening approached, the center hummed with the day's final activities. In the EE Memory Wall Room, a new section had been added, a growing collection of victory moments documenting each family's steps forward. Photos showed the Martinez's first batch of bread, scholarship recipients in their new universities, children performing in the center's cultural programs. Rachel found Sarah there, adding a new photo to the wall, one of herself teaching younger children how to organize community projects. "Dad would be proud of this," Sarah said softly, using his name to help people believe in second chances. Rachel wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders. He believed that truth could heal if it was handled with love. "Look around. Every person here is proof that he was right." Through the windows, they could see Alexander deep in conversation with James and Elena, planning the center's expansion to other neighborhoods. The demand for their services had quickly outgrown their space. "Uncle Alex is different now," Sarah observed. "Happier." Rachel smiled. "We all are, sweetheart. Because we're not just helping others heal, we're healing ourselves too. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows through the center's skylights, the day's activities wound down, but the impact of what happened within these walls would continue to ripple outward, touching more lives, creating more stories of renewal and hope. In the quiet of the empty main hall, Sarah's welcome signs still hung proudly, their messages more meaningful now than ever. Your story matters. Here, truth heals. Family is more than blood. And perhaps most importantly, it's never too late for a new beginning. The autumn sun cast golden light across Alexander's study, now rarely used for business meetings. Instead, the room had become a gathering place for family moments and community planning. Today, it hosted a special celebration, Sarah's first semester report card from her new school. Straight A's, Mrs. Reynolds announced proudly, serving Sarah's favorite hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. And look at these teacher comments about your community leadership project. Sarah beamed, but her eyes kept darting to Rachel, seeking her mother's approval. Rachel pulled her daughter close, her own eyes shining with pride and something deeper, the joy of being able to openly celebrate her child's achievements after years of hiding. Your father loved learning, Rachel said softly. He always said education was a light that darkness couldn't extinguish. That's why the scholarship program means so much. Alexander watched them from his desk, marveling at how much had changed. The driven businessman, who once measured success in profit margins, now found his greatest satisfaction in the center's weekly progress reports. His company still thrived, but with a new mission, using its resources to help rebuild the lives Harrison had destroyed. Elena entered with her tablet, but today she wasn't tracking investigations. The first Michael Harrison scholar just made the dean's list, she announced, and 3 more families have offered to join our mentorship program. James, who had been quietly reviewing community outreach proposals, looked up with a smile. We're going to need a bigger space soon. The waiting list for programs grows every week. The change in James was perhaps the most surprising. The man who had once prioritized corporate success above all else now spent his evenings teaching business ethics to aspiring entrepreneurs, helping them build companies founded on integrity. Actually, Alexander said, pulling out a folder he'd been saving for this moment, I have something to show you all. He spread out architectural plans across his desk. Everyone gathered around, curious. The old Harrison Bank building, he explained. The federal authorities are releasing it from evidence next month. I've put in a bid to purchase it. Sarah's eyes widened. The building where we found the truth? Alexander nodded. I thought we could turn it into something meaningful. The main floor could be another community center, bigger than our current one. The upper floors could house educational programs, job training facilities, maybe even a proper business incubator for families starting over. And the vault? Rachel asked softly, thinking of the room that had held so many dark secrets. I want to turn it into a research center, Alexander replied. A place where people can study corporate ethics, learn from past mistakes, and find ways to prevent other families from being hurt the way Harrison hurt all of us. Mrs. Reynolds dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. Full circle, she murmured, from a place of secrets to a place of light. Sarah studied the plans intently. Can we have a garden on the roof? She asked. Something beautiful growing above where all the bad things were kept. I think that's a wonderful idea, Rachel said, squeezing her daughter's shoulder. Growth above pain. That's what we've all been doing, isn't it? The changes in their lives went beyond their work at the center. Rachel had started writing a book, sharing her experiences to help others find the courage to stand up against corruption. Alexander had simplified his life, selling his mansion and moving into a comfortable family home where Sarah and Rachel lived with him. Even Mrs. Reynolds had transformed from a quietly observant housekeeper to a confident program director, using her years of careful attention to detail to help organize the center's expanding services. Sometimes I look at old photos, Sarah said, moving to the window, and I barely recognize myself, that scared girl in the alley always cleaning to feel safe. She touched her father's letter, which she now kept in a silver locket matching her mother's. But then I remember what Dad wrote about truth making us stronger. Alexander joined her at the window. Beyond the garden, they could see the city skyline, no longer a battlefield of corporate power, but a community of interconnected lives and stories. "You know what's amazing?" he said softly. "When you showed up that rainy night, I thought I was helping you, but really, you helped all of us find our way back to what matters most." Rachel wrapped her arms around her daughter from behind. "That's what family does," she said. "We save each other, even when we don't know we need saving." The room fell quiet, each person lost in thoughts of their journey. The afternoon sun painted everything in warm gold, and through the open window came the sound of children laughing. In the garden, scholarship recipients tutoring younger students, continuing the cycle of healing and hope. In that moment, they all felt it. The presence of Michael Harrison's spirit in the work they did, in the lives they touched, in the truth that had finally set them all free. His legacy lived on, not in the power he'd fought against, but in the love that had transformed their wounds into wisdom, their pain into purpose. And in Sarah's bright eyes, they saw the future they were building. A future where truth and compassion walked hand in hand, where families could heal and grow stronger together, where every ending could become a new beginning. Winter had draped the city in a soft blanket of snow when the news came. Alexander's bid for the old Harrison Bank building had been accepted. The family gathered in the former bank's grand lobby, their footsteps echoing in the empty space that would soon pulse with new life. Sarah walked the marble floors where months ago they had confronted long-buried truths, her hand trailing along the walls. "It feels different now," she said. "Less scary, like it's waiting for something good to happen." Rachel nodded, studying the architectural features with new eyes. "The ironwork in these windows, your father used to admire it. He said it reminded him of how delicate things could be surprisingly strong." Eleanor and James were already mapping out the space on their tablets, their excitement evident in their rapid-fire exchange of ideas. "The main banking hall would be perfect for the new educational center," Elena suggested. "Those high ceilings, all this natural light. And look at these side offices," James added. "We could turn them into consultation rooms for the legal aid program, maybe even set up a small business advisory center." Alexander stood in the center of it all, remembering that tense night months ago when truth had finally broken free. Now, watching his family and friends plan this transformation, he felt a deep sense of rightness. "Uncle Alex," Sarah called from the staircase, "come see what we found." He followed her voice to the second floor, where she and Mrs. Reynolds were examining a wall of old photographs, the bank's history displayed in fading black and white. "Look," Sarah pointed to one particular image. "That's Grandfather Harrison with Mr. Martinez's father. They're shaking hands in front of the bank." Mrs. Reynolds leaned closer to read the caption. "Opening day of Martinez Imports, 1975. One of the first businesses Harrison Sr. helped establish, before he began destroying them." "We should keep these photos," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Put them in the truth room, next to pictures of what we're building now, to show how things can change." Rachel joined them, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. Acknowledging the past while building a better future." Their planning session was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Sophia Martinez and her grandmother, carrying boxes of their now famous pastries. "We heard you got the building," Mrs. Martinez said, her eyes taking in the space, with a mix of old pain and new hope. "We wanted to be part of this first day of planning. These pastries, they're made from the recipe my husband was developing when we lost everything." Sarah helped arrange the pastries on a makeshift table. Proper furniture wouldn't arrive for weeks. "But now everyone can taste them," she said, brightly. "And your story helps other families believe in new beginnings." As they shared the treats, more people began arriving, scholarship recipients offering to help with renovation plans, families from the support groups wanting to contribute. Ideas, young entrepreneurs eager to be part of the new business incubator program. "It's happening again," Eleanor observed quietly to Alexander. "Just like with the first center, people aren't just coming for help anymore, they're coming to be part of something bigger." She was right. The empty bank building was already beginning. to feel alive with possibilities. In one corner, scholarship students were discussing workshop ideas with James. Near the old teller windows, Mrs. Martinez was describing her vision for a cultural food program to celebrate the diversity of families they helped. Sarah flitted between groups, her notebook filling with ideas and suggestions. She'd developed a talent for seeing connections, how one family's story could help another, how different skills could complement each other. "Mom," she called out suddenly, "remember what Dad wrote about truth needing witnesses? Maybe that's what this place should be. Not just a center for help, but a place where everyone's story gets witnessed and honored." Rachel's eyes filled, with tears as she hugged her daughter. "He would have loved that idea, sweetheart, using this building that once held so many secrets to help people speak their truth." As the afternoon progressed, the group moved through the building, each room sparking new ideas. The old vault, once filled with evidence of Harrison's crimes, would become a library and research center. The executive offices would transform into classrooms and counseling spaces. But it was on the roof that the most poignant moment occurred. Despite the winter chill, Sarah insisted they all come up to see her vision for the garden she'd proposed. "We can plant things in seasons," she explained, her breath visible in the cold air. "So something's always growing, always changing. And look, you can see both centers from here. The old one where we started and this one where we're growing." Alexander watched his niece gesture excitedly, pointing out where each element of her garden would go. She'd come so far from the scared girl he'd found cleaning a dark alley. Yet in many ways, she was still the same, still believing in the power of taking something broken and making it beautiful. "You know what this means?" Rachel said softly, joining him at the roof's edge. "We're not just helping people rebuild anymore. We're showing them how to build something entirely new." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered city, the group reluctantly prepared to leave. But something had shifted in the building's atmosphere. The spaces that had once held darkness now hummed with potential, with dreams of transformation. Sarah was the last to leave the roof, pausing to watch her breath mist in the winter air. "Dad's letter was right," she said to no one in particular. "Truth with love really can rebuild worlds." And standing there, surrounded by the family that fate and courage had brought together, they all felt it, the certainty that this was just the beginning of an even greater story. Spring brought new challenges along with its promise of renewal. The renovation of the old Harrison Bank building was well underway, but with each step forward came unexpected hurdles. Today, the family faced one of their biggest tests yet. "Another article?" Rachel asked, watching Alexander read the morning paper with a furrowed brow. The local business journal had published a piece questioning the practicality of their expanding programs, suggesting that the family was squandering resources on lost causes. "They're saying we're too idealistic," Alexander replied, but there was no defeat in his voice. "That helping families rebuild their lives isn't a sustainable business model." Sarah, who had been organizing files for the day's programs, looked up with determination. "Then we'll prove them wrong, like the Martinez family did, their bakeries, already hiring 2 more people." Indeed, success stories were beginning to multiply. The first group of Michael Harrison scholars was excelling in their studies. The legal aid program had helped dozens of families reclaim lost assets, and the entrepreneurship program was launching its 3rd cohort of small business owners. But challenges remained. That morning, Eleanor brought concerning news during their daily planning meeting. "Some of Harrison's old allies are trying to block our permit for the new building," she reported. "They're claiming historical preservation concerns." James leaned forward, his expression serious. "They're scared. Every family we help, every story we bring to light, threatens their carefully maintained power structure." "Good," Sarah said firmly, surprising them all with her fierceness. "Dad's letter says that when people try to stop you from telling the truth, it means you're on the right path." Rachel smiled at her daughter's wisdom, but concern shadowed her eyes. "The question is, how do we move forward without letting them turn this into another power struggle?" Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Reynolds entered with unexpected visitors, the Martinez family, accompanied by representatives from 3 other successful program graduates. "We heard about the permit problems," Sofia Martinez announced, "and we have an idea." What followed was a testament to the very community they'd helped build. The families had organized themselves, gathering signatures and testimonials from hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the center's programs. "We're not just success stories," Mrs. Martinez explained, her accent strong with emotion. "We're proof that healing multiplies. My bakery now helps other families. Maria's tutoring program reaches children across the city. When you help one family stand up, we all rise together." Sarah's face lit up. "That's it. We don't fight their power with more power. We show them something stronger." Alexander watched his niece race to the memory wall, where she began pulling photos and stories. "We'll invite everyone to the permit hearing," she continued excitedly. "Not to protest, but to share. Every family, every story, every small victory that grew into something bigger." Rachel's eyes filled with tears of pride. Using truth to build bridges instead of walls. Michael would have loved that approach. The next weeks became a flurry of preparation. The families worked together, documenting their journeys of recovery and renewal. The scholarship students created presentations, showing how education was breaking cycles of powerlessness. Even the children contributed, drawing pictures of their hopes for the new center. On the day of the hearing, the city council chamber was packed. One by one, people stood to speak, not with anger or accusations, but with stories of transformation. Mrs. Martinez shared how her rekindled family business was now helping other immigrant entrepreneurs. A scholarship student explained how studying law had empowered her to help her community. Sarah, watching from between her mother and uncle, squeezed their hands as the council members' expressions shifted from skepticism to understanding. When it was her turn to speak, she carried her father's letter to the podium. "My father believed. That truth needs love to heal," she said, her clear voice carrying through the chamber. "In these centers, we're not just helping people recover what was lost. We're creating something new. A community where everyone's story matters, where healing one family means healing all of us." The permit was approved unanimously. Later that evening, as the family gathered in their home to celebrate, Alexander found Sarah in the garden she'd started, tending to early spring sprouts. "You know what I realized today?" he said, kneeling beside her. "We've been calling them centers, but they're really more like hearts, places where life flows out to the whole community." Sarah nodded, gently touching a tiny green shoot. "Like these plants. They start small, but they grow, and then they make seeds for new plants. Mom says that's how healing works too. It keeps spreading if you give it chance." Rachel joined them, carrying Michael's letter. "Speaking of spreading healing," she said, "the council member who spoke in our favor, she asked if we'd consider helping other cities start similar programs." "Really?" Sarah's eyes widened. "We could help even more families." Alexander looked at his sister and niece, remembering how far they'd come from that rainy night in the alley. Every challenge they'd faced had only strengthened their commitment to the truth, to healing, to building something larger than themselves. "So why not?" he smiled. "After all, your father's letter says truth with love can rebuild worlds. Maybe it's time to rebuild more than just our corner of it." As the spring evening settled around them, they could hear the sounds of the city, not just its usual rhythm, but the newer melody of hope they'd helped create. In gardens and bakeries, classrooms and community centers, truth was taking root, growing stronger with each new day, each new story, each new heart opened to possibility. The video conference room in the new center hummed with energy as faces appeared on the large screen. Community leaders from Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, and other major cities, all eager to learn about the Michael Harrison Initiative. Sarah sat between Rachel and Alexander, carefully reviewing her presentation notes. At 13, she'd become the program's most passionate advocate, her personal journey touching hearts across the country. "Remember," she whispered to herself, "Dad's letter says every city has its own stories waiting to be heard." Elena managed the technical aspects while James prepared to share the business model they'd developed. The success of their first two centers had created a blueprint that could be adapted for different communities. "We're getting more requests," Elena reported, checking her tablet. "3 more cities just this morning. The Martinez family's story went viral after that national news feature. Indeed, Mrs. Martinez had become something of a celebrity in social impact circles. Her bakery, now employing families from the center's programs, had inspired similar initiatives across the country. "Shall we begin?" Alexander asked, looking at his family. When they nodded, he turned to address the screens. "Welcome, everyone. We're here to share not just a program, but a vision of how truth and compassion can transform communities." Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and confident. "6 months ago, people said our approach wouldn't work. They said you couldn't build successful businesses on healing and hope." She smiled. "Today I want to introduce you to some people who proved them wrong." The presentation screen filled with faces and stories, the Martinez family's expanding business empire, scholarship recipients who'd started community programs in their universities, families who'd reclaimed lost properties and turned them into neighborhood resources. "But this isn't just about business success," Rachel added, standing beside her daughter. "It's about creating spaces where truth can heal, where families can rebuild, where communities can grow stronger together." Questions poured in from the city representatives. How did they handle resistance from established power structures? How did they balance business sustainability with social impact? How did they measure success beyond financial metrics? James stepped in to explain the practical aspects, the legal framework they'd developed, the funding models, the partnership strategies. But it was Sarah who captured the essence of their work. "In every city, there are people cleaning alleys at night," she said, her words carrying the weight of personal experience. "There are families holding onto old recipes and faded photographs, waiting for a chance to rebuild. There are children carrying secrets too heavy for their shoulders. We don't just give them help, we give them a place to belong, a way to turn their pain into purpose." The Chicago representative leaned forward. "The Martinez model particularly interests us. We have several neighborhoods with similar histories of displaced family businesses." "That's where we start," Sarah explained excitedly. "Find your Martinez family, the ones who kept their dreams alive even when everything was taken away. Help them rebuild, and they'll help others do the same." Rachel watched her daughter with pride. Sarah had taken everything she'd learned about survival and transformed it into wisdom that could help others thrive. The scared girl from the alley had become a beacon of hope for others, finding their way out of darkness. As the meeting progressed, commitments were made, partnerships formed. Each city would adapt the program to its unique needs while maintaining the core principles that made it work: truth, compassion, and the power of community healing. Later, in the center's rooftop garden, now blooming with spring flowers, the family reflected on the day's events. "It's really happening, isn't it?" Mrs. Reynolds said, serving her signature hot chocolate. "Michael's legacy spreading across the country." "Not just his legacy," Alexander replied, watching Sarah tend to her beloved plants, "but the legacy of every family who found their voice here. Every story that proved truth can heal when it's handled with love." Rachel touched the locket at her neck, matching the one Sarah wore. "I used to think we were running away," she said softly. "But really we were running toward this moment, when all those years of protecting the truth could help others find their way home." Sarah looked up from her gardening. "Mom, remember how you used to tell me stories about different cities when we were moving around? You said each one had its own heart, its own way of healing?" "I remember, sweetheart." "Well, now we get to help them find it." Sarah's eyes sparkled with possibilities. "Like these flowers, each one grows differently, needs different care, but they all make the garden more beautiful together." As evening fell, they could see lights coming on in both centers, the original building where their journey began, and the transformed bank where their vision had expanded. Between them, the city pulsed with stories of renewal, each one a testament to the power of truth wrapped in love. Alexander's phone buzzed with messages from more cities interested in the program, but for now he let them wait. Here in the garden, watching his family dream even bigger dreams, he understood what real success meant. Not the power to shape cities, but the privilege of helping them heal. One truth, one family, one story at a time. Summer arrived with both promise and challenge. The Michael Harrison Initiative had caught the attention of major philanthropic organizations, bringing opportunities for expansion that required careful consideration. The family gathered in their favorite meeting spot, the memory wall room where their journey's every step was documented. These investment offers are substantial, Elena reported, displaying the latest proposals. They could help us establish centers in 20 more cities by year's end. Sarah, cross-legged in her usual chair, frowned slightly. But some of them want to change how we do things, make it more suit efficient. She spoke the word as if it left a bad taste in her mouth. They call it streamlining, James added, but it would mean less individual attention, more standardized processes. Rachel exchanged glances with Alexander. They'd faced this crossroads before, the temptation to grow faster at the cost of what made their program special. I think, Sarah said slowly, we need to ask ourselves what Dad would say. She pulled out his letter, worn soft with frequent reading. He wrote that truth needs witnesses, not just processes, that healing happens person to person, story to story. Alexander nodded, remembering that rainy night when he'd first stopped to really see one small girl in an alley. If I'd followed standard procedures then, I would have just given you money and walked away. And if Mrs. Martinez had been put through a streamlined program, Rachel added, we might have missed the power of her family's story to inspire others. Elena's tablet chimed with another message. Boston's ready to launch their first center. They've already found their Martinez family. 3 generations of craftsmen who lost their furniture business in a development scheme. That's it, Sarah jumped up excitedly. What if we grow like Mum and I did when we were in hiding? City by city, person by person, keeping each other safe and strong? The idea resonated. Instead of rapid expansion, they could create a network of interconnected communities, each growing at its own pace while supporting the others. Mrs. Reynolds entered with afternoon tea and her ever-present wisdom. When you're baking bread, she said, setting down the tray, you can't rush the rising. Each loaf needs its own time to become what it's meant to be. As they discussed this organic approach to growth, more visitors arrived, graduates of their programs who'd become leaders in their own right. Sophia Martinez, now running 3 community bakeries. Maria Chen, James's niece, who'd started a youth advocacy program. Each brought stories of how personal attention and genuine care had made their success possible. Maybe that's our answer, Alexander mused. Instead of growing bigger, we grow deeper, help each center develop its own character while staying true to our core principles. Sarah was already sketching in her notebook, a new garden design that reflected this philosophy. Look, she explained, showing her drawing. Each section is different, but they're all connected underground, sharing strength through their roots. Rachel smiled at her daughter's metaphor. Just like the families we help. Each has their own way of healing, but they're stronger together. They spent the afternoon drafting guidelines for sustainable growth, not rigid rules, but principles that would help each new center maintain the human touch that made their program work. Truth needs time, Sarah read from her notes. Healing needs patience. Communities need space to grow their own way. As they worked, the summer sun traced patterns through the skylights, illuminating the photos on the memory wall. Each image told a story of transformation, not just of individuals and families, but of how small acts of compassion could ripple outward to touch countless lives. Alexander watched Sarah move between the groups, offering insights that bridged practical concerns with heartfelt purpose. She'd grown so much, yet kept the essential wisdom that had first touched his heart. The understanding that real change happens one person, one story, one moment of truth at a time. You know what this reminds me of? Rachel said softly, joining him. Those nights when we'd plan our next move, always careful to keep Sarah's needs at the center of every decision. We're doing the same thing now, just on a larger scale. Family protecting families, Alexander agreed, growing carefully, staying true to what matters most. As evening approached, they had their answer for the philanthropic organizations. A clear vision for growth that prioritized depth over speed, genuine connection over efficient processing, and the power of individual stories over standardized solutions. Sarah added one final note to their guidelines, quoting from her father's letter. Truth with love rebuilds worlds. but only if we give each world the time and care it needs to heal its own way. Looking around the room at their extended family, blood relations and chosen allies alike, they all felt the rightness of this path. Their work would grow, but like Sarah's garden, it would grow with grace, each root and branch nurtured by the same principles that had brought them together that rainy night so many months ago. The first anniversary of the Michael Harrison Memorial Community Center arrived with an unexpected gift, a documentary film created by the scholarship students, capturing the stories of families whose lives had been transformed over the past year. In the center's main hall, now filled with comfortable chairs and warm lighting, a diverse audience gathered for the premiere. Sarah sat between Rachel and Alexander, clutching her father's letter as the lights dimmed. The film opened with a simple scene, the Martinez Bakery at dawn, where Mrs. Martinez now trained other families in both baking and business skills. Through her program alone, 12 new family businesses had started in the past year. "The bread rises with our hopes," Mrs. Martinez's voice narrated. "Each loaf carries the stories of those who came before, the dreams of those who will come after." The documentary moved through the city, showing how one act of healing had led to another. A scholarship recipient who'd become a lawyer was helping other families reclaim lost properties. Children who'd once been afraid to dream were now leading community projects. Sarah's voice came through clear and strong in her interview segment. "My mum always said that truth needs witnesses. Now I understand. We're all witnesses to each other's healing, and that makes us stronger together." The film showed the rooftop garden Sarah had created, now a lush paradise where therapy sessions and youth programs took place among the flowers and vegetables. Children who'd experienced trauma found peace there, learning to nurture life and hope. Rachel squeezed her daughter's hand as they watched scenes from their journey unfold. The scared girl from the alley had become a beacon of hope for others, showing how pain could be transformed into purpose. The documentary captured moments from the newer centers too. Boston's furniture makers mentoring young apprentices, Chicago's restored family businesses creating neighborhood revival, San Francisco's tech training program helping displaced workers rebuild their careers. But it was the personal stories that moved everyone most deeply. A teenage girl, once homeless like Sarah had been, now ran a successful tutoring program. An elderly man who'd lost everything to Harrison's schemes had opened a community art studio where he taught children about creativity and resilience. "What we've learned," Elena's voice explained in the film, "is that healing multiplies. Each person who finds their strength becomes a light for others." The documentary showed James working with young entrepreneurs, teaching them to build businesses based on integrity and community value. "We're not just rebuilding what was lost," he said. "We're creating something better, an economy of connection and care." Mrs. Reynolds appeared in several scenes, her quiet wisdom touching hearts as she shared how small acts of kindness could change lives. "Sometimes," she said, "all it takes is one person willing to truly see another's worth." As the film progressed, it revealed the ripple effects of their work, how families who'd been helped were now helping others, how communities were coming together to support each other, how truth and love were indeed rebuilding worlds. The most powerful moment came near the end, when the camera panned across the memory wall, now extended through several rooms. Each photo, document, and story piece told part of a larger narrative of healing and hope. "My father believed," Sarah's voice narrated over these images, "that truth needs love to heal. But what we've discovered is that love needs truth too. When we're brave enough to share our stories, to witness each other's pain and triumph, we create something stronger than any power built on fear." Alexander watched his niece as she spoke these words, remembering how far they'd all come. The business titan who'd once measured success in profit margins now saw wealth in the light of transformed lives. The film ended with a sunrise scene at the old Harrison Bank, now a bustling center of learning and healing. Children played in the courtyard while inside. People of all ages worked together to build new dreams. As the lights came up, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. But these weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of recognition, of hope, of belonging to something larger than individual pain or triumph. Rachel stood to address the audience, her voice steady with emotion. "A year ago, we thought we were creating a place for healing. What we've actually created is a family, one that grows stronger with each new story, each new member, each new act of courage and compassion." Sarah added her own words. "And like any family, we keep learning from each other. Every person who comes through these doors teaches us something new about strength, about hope, about the power of truth wrapped in love." After the screening, people lingered, sharing stories and making connections. The Martinez family had brought special bread shaped like rising suns, their symbol of new beginnings. Children from the art program displayed paintings inspired by the stories they'd heard. In a quiet moment, Alexander found Sarah in her garden, tending to a new section she'd created for healing herbs. "You know what I realized watching the film?" she said, not looking up from her work. "We're all like these plants. Some of us grow tall right away, some need more time, some grow stronger through hard seasons. But together, we make something beautiful." Looking out over the city as the sun set, Alexander could see lights coming on in homes and businesses that had been restored through their program. Each light represented a story of renewal, a testament to the power of truth and love to rebuild not just buildings or businesses, but human hearts. And somewhere he felt certain, Michael Harrison was smiling at the legacy his courage had inspired, a legacy that continued to grow, one truth, one heart, one story at a time. On a crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood at the podium of the National Conference on Community Transformation, her father's letter tucked safely in her locket. At 14, she'd become the youngest keynote speaker in the conference's history, but it was her experience, not her age, that had brought her there. The audience included representatives from 50 cities across the country, each running or planning their own versions of the Michael Harrison Initiative. Rachel and Alexander sat in the front row, their hearts swelling with pride as Sarah began to speak. "My journey began in an alley," she said, her clear voice carrying through the hall. "I was a girl who thought cleaning streets was the only way to earn my place in the world. But one rainy night someone stopped to really see me, and that moment of truth and compassion started a chain reaction that brings us all here today." She shared their story, not just the dramatic revelations and victories, but the small everyday moments that had shown them how healing really works. The early morning baking lessons with Mrs. Martinez, the quiet conversations in the rooftop garden, the way each family that found help became help for others. "We've learned that transformation isn't about big programs or perfect systems," she continued. "It's about creating spaces where truth can be spoken, where pain can become purpose, where every story matters." Elena and James presented data showing the initiative's impact across participating cities. Thousands of families helped, hundreds of businesses restored or started, dozens of communities revitalized. But it was the personal stories that moved people most. A video montage showed scenes from different centers. Boston's furniture makers teaching young apprentices the value of craftsmanship and integrity. Chicago's restored family businesses, creating neighborhood renaissance. San Francisco's tech training program, helping displaced workers rebuild their futures. Rachel took the stage to explain their organic growth model. "We don't franchise hope," she said. "We cultivate it, letting each community find its own way of healing while staying connected to the larger family we're building." Alexander shared how his view of success had transformed. "I used to think power came from controlling resources," he admitted. "Now I know true power comes from releasing them, letting them flow where they're needed most, guided by compassion and truth." Mrs. Reynolds spoke about the importance of individual attention in an age of automation. "Every person who comes through our doors has a unique story," she said. "Our job is to listen, to witness, to help them find their way back to hope." The Martinez family, now running a network of community bakeries across 3 states, demonstrated how success could multiply without losing its heart. "Each loaf of bread still carries stories," Mrs. Martinez said. "Each business we help start becomes part of a larger family of hope." As the conference continued, something remarkable happened. People began sharing their own stories of transformation, not just success stories, but honest accounts of struggles overcome, lessons learned, hope restored. During a break, Sarah found herself in the conference center's garden, where she'd insisted on planting flowers before the event. Rachel joined her there. "Your father would be so proud," she said softly, "not just of what we've built, but of how we've built it, with truth and love at every step." Sarah touched her locket. "I used to think his letter was just for us," she replied, "but now I understand it was for everyone who needs to believe that truth can heal, that love can rebuild worlds." Alexander appeared with news that more cities wanted to join the initiative, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, they felt ready. Their careful, organic approach had created a strong foundation for growth. "It's like my garden," Sarah explained to the new partners. "We don't force things to grow faster than they should. We create the right conditions, soil, water, light, and then trust each plant to grow in its own way, in its own time." As evening fell, the conference center glowed with warmth. In every corner, people shared stories and made connections. Children from various centers performed a play they'd written together about hope and renewal. The Martinez family's bread filled the air with the scent of new beginnings. Rachel watched it all with tears in her eyes. "Remember when we were running, Sarah? Always hiding, always afraid." Sarah hugged her mother. "Now we're helping others stop running, helping them find their way home." Alexander joined them, carrying a surprise, a book of collected stories from all the centers, dedicated to Michael Harrison's memory. "Your father's courage didn't end with him," he told Sarah. "It lives on in every person who chooses truth over fear, love over power." As the conference drew to a close, Sarah made one final observation that captured the heart of their work. "We're not just healing the past anymore," she said. "We're building a future where truth doesn't need to hide, where love isn't afraid to shine, where every story of healing helps light the way for others." And across the country, in centers and communities touched by their work, that light continued to grow stronger, proving that one moment of compassion could indeed start a revolution of hope. Winter brought an unexpected invitation that marked a new chapter in their journey. The National Business Ethics Committee had requested Sarah and Alexander to present their model of community-centered business development at their annual symposium. The venue was ironically fitting, the same luxury hotel where Alexander had once negotiated mergers and acquisitions with Harrison. Now he stood at the podium beside his niece, watching her command the attention of the country's most influential business leaders. "Traditional business measures success in profits," Sarah began, her confidence growing with each word. "We measure it in restored lives, in renewed hope, in communities rebuilt. And here's the surprising part. When you put people first, sustainable profit follows naturally." The presentation screen behind them displayed their results. The Martinez family's bakery network had created over 300 jobs across multiple cities. The furniture makers in Boston had revived an entire crafts district. Chicago's restored family businesses had sparked neighborhood renewals that attracted sustainable investment. "But these aren't just success stories," Sarah continued. "They're proof that business can be both profitable and healing, that power doesn't have to corrupt, that truth and compassion can be the foundation of real, lasting success." Rachel, watching from the audience, felt tears well up as her daughter spoke. The scared girl from the alley had become a powerful advocate for systemic change, turning her own healing journey into a blueprint for others. Elena presented the data that had caught the committee's attention. Lower recidivism rates in neighborhoods with center programs, improved educational outcomes, increased small business survival rates. But it was the personal stories that truly moved the audience. Mrs. Martinez took the stage to share how her family's recovery had created a ripple effect of opportunity for others. "Each person we help becomes help for someone else," she explained. "It's not charity, it's community, it's family." James, who'd once prioritized corporate profits above all else, spoke about the transformation in his own understanding of business ethics. "We're not just changing how companies operate," he said. "We're changing how we define success itself." During the panel discussion, business leaders from across the country asked probing questions about implementing similar models in their own organizations. Sarah's responses showed wisdom beyond her years. Start with one truth, she advised. Find one story that needs to be witnessed, one wound that needs healing. Let that guide you to the next step and the next. Just like in our garden, you don't plant everything at once. You let each season teach you what needs to grow next. Alexander shared how their approach had actually strengthened his company's position in the market. When you build on truth and operate with compassion, you create something more sustainable than any empire built on fear and power. The symposium's surprising highlight came when a group of business school deans announced their commitment to incorporating the Michael Harrison Initiative's principles into their ethics curriculum. Sarah's father's story would now help shape the next generation of business leaders. During a break, Sarah wandered to the hotel's rooftop garden. Unlike her carefully tended spaces at the centers, this one was more for show than healing. Yet, even here she found signs of life pushing through, small wildflowers growing between the carefully manicured plants. Rachel found her there, both of them touching their matching lockets in an unconscious gesture of connection to Michael's memory. "Dad's letter talks about rebuilding worlds," Sarah said softly. "I used to think he meant just our world, our family, but he meant every world touched by fear and power, every place where truth needs to grow." Inside, the symposium continued with breakout sessions on implementing ethical business practices. Mrs. Reynolds led a discussion on the importance of individual attention in organizational culture. "Every number in your spreadsheet is a story," she reminded them. "Every policy affects real lives." Alexander watched it all with a sense of wonder. The corporate world he'd once navigated with such calculated precision was beginning to embrace a different kind of strength, the power of truth told with compassion, of success measured in healing rather than just profit. As evening fell, Elena brought more news. Other industry groups wanted to develop similar initiatives. Healthcare networks, educational institutions, even government agencies were reaching out to learn from their experience. "It's like what you always say about your garden, Sarah," she smiled. "When you plant something true and tend it with love, you never know how far its seeds will spread." The day ended with an impromptu gathering in the hotel's grand ballroom. Families from various centers shared their stories with business leaders, breaking down the barriers between boardroom theory and lived experience. The Martinez family had brought their special bread, of course, and as people broke bread together, something shifted. The formal business symposium became a celebration of human connection, of the power of story to bridge divides and open hearts. Sarah's final words to the gathering captured the essence of their evolving mission. "We're not just changing business practices or rebuilding communities. We're remembering what business was always meant to be, a way for people to help each other thrive. A way to build something larger than ourselves, something that grows stronger with every truth told, every life touched, every heart open to possibility." Spring arrived with a new milestone for the Michael Harrison Initiative. The first university partnership program was launching, integrating their approach to community healing and ethical business practices into the curriculum. Sarah, now approaching her 15th birthday, had been asked to help design the program. The planning meeting took place in the original center's rooftop garden, now a lush paradise that served as a living classroom for their principals. Educational. Leaders from across the country gathered among the blooming flowers and herbs, experiencing firsthand how environment shapes learning. "Traditional education often separates head from heart," Sarah explained, leading the group through the garden's themed sections. "But healing and growth happen when we connect them. Every plant here has a story, just like every person who comes to our centers." Rachel watched her daughter with pride, remembering the nights they'd spent on the run, when Sarah's only education had been the stories they shared in hidden rooms. Now she was helping shape how others would learn about truth, healing, and community building. The university program would be unlike any traditional business or social work curriculum. Students would learn not just from books and lectures, but from direct engagement with families and communities. Each class would be paired with a center, making real-world impact part of the learning process. "Theory needs practice," Alexander explained to the educators. "Just like we discovered in our own journey, understanding comes through doing, through witnessing, through being part of something larger than ourselves." Elena presented the innovative assessment methods they'd developed. Instead of just grades and papers, students would document their learning through story collections, community impact projects, and personal reflection journals. "We're not just teaching skills," she said. "We're nurturing wisdom, the kind that comes from connecting heart knowledge with head knowledge." The Martinez family hosted a lunch break, turning it into a lesson about the role of cultural traditions in community healing. As they shared their bread and stories, university administrators began to see how every interaction could become a teaching moment. "In our bakery apprentice program," Mrs. Martinez explained, "we don't just teach baking, we teach history, mathematics, business ethics, cultural studies, all through the lens of bread making. Everything connects when you let truth and love guide the learning." James, who now guest lectured at business schools about ethical leadership, shared how their approach was changing corporate recruitment practices. Companies are starting to look for graduates who understand that profit and purpose can work together, that success can be measured in human flourishing. Sarah led the group to the memory wall, now expanded into an interactive learning space. "Every story here is a lesson," she said, "about resilience, about transformation, about the power of truth to heal when it's witnessed with love." The wall's newest section featured educational materials developed from their experiences, case studies, documentary films, personal narratives that would help students understand the real-world impact of business decisions. Mrs. Reynolds, who had become a beloved mentor to many young people at the centers, spoke about the importance of intergenerational learning. "Wisdom flows both ways," she said. "The young teach us courage to change while the elders share the patience to persist." As the day progressed, more elements of the educational program took shape. There would be community storytelling workshops, ethical business laboratories, healing gardens at every partner campus. Students would learn not just about social impact, but how to create it while staying true to their own stories. In a quiet moment, Rachel found Sarah in her favorite corner of the garden, tending to a new plant variety she was experimenting with. "What are you growing here?" she asked. "Hope flowers," Sarah replied with a smile. "They bloom even in difficult conditions, and their seeds spread easily. Like the truth, once it takes root, it finds ways to grow." The education leaders left with more than just a program outline. They carried with them a new vision of learning, one that honored both intellectual rigor and emotional wisdom, that recognized the teaching power of personal stories and lived experience. That evening, as the family gathered for their regular end-of-day reflection, Alexander shared news that seemed to complete a circle. The old Harrison Bank building, where their journey of truth had reached its turning point, would become the site of the initiative's first dedicated educational center. "Think about it," Sarah said, touching her locket where her father's letter rested. "A place that once held secrets will now teach people how to speak truth. A place built on power will teach the strength of compassion." Rachel hugged her daughter, both of them feeling Michael's presence in this new chapter of their story. "Your father believed that truth needed love to heal," she said. "Now we're teaching others how to create that healing in their own communities." As night fell over the city, lights glowed in windows of homes and businesses touched by their work. But now those lights seemed to shine with new purpose, not just marking places of healing and hope, but becoming beacons of learning, guiding others toward a future where truth and love could indeed rebuild worlds. One lesson, one story, one heart at a time. The International Conference Room at the United Nations hummed with anticipation. Representatives from 30 countries had gathered to learn about the Michael Harrison Initiative's approach to community healing and ethical business practices. Sarah, now 15, stood at the podium alongside Rachel and Alexander, their story, about to reach a global audience. The Secretary General himself had introduced them, highlighting how their model of truth-centered community rebuilding had caught the attention of social innovation experts worldwide. But it was Sarah's opening, words that captured everyone's hearts. "Truth speaks all languages," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Pain knows no borders, and healing, when it comes from love, can bridge any divide." The presentation screens displayed live video feeds from centers across America, showing how local communities had been transformed. The Martinez family's bakery, Network had inspired similar initiatives in European cities. Boston's furniture makers were now collaborating with artisan communities in South America. Rachel shared how their journey had started with one personal truth that needed telling. "We thought we were running from power," she said, "but really, we were running toward a different kind of strength, the power of witness truth to heal. Not just individuals, but entire communities." International development experts were particularly interested in their organic growth model. Alexander explained how they'd resisted the urge to standardize their approach, instead letting each community adapt the core principles to their own cultural context. "It's like my niece's garden," he said, gesturing to images of Sarah's rooftop sanctuary. "Every climate needs different plants, different care, but the fundamental principles of growth remain the same. Good soil, clean water, plenty of light, and patient tending." Eleanor presented case studies from their university partnerships, now expanded to include international exchange programs. Students from different countries learn from each other's experiences, creating a global network of ethical business leaders. "We're not just sharing knowledge," she explained. "We're creating connections that transcend cultural and economic boundaries." During the break, delegates gathered in small groups, sharing stories from their own communities. A representative from Kenya described how their version of the Martinez bakery model had revived traditional grain farming practices, while creating new economic opportunities. Sarah moved among the groups, listening intently. In each story, she heard echoes of her own journey, the universal human experiences of loss, hope, and renewal. Mrs. Reynolds, who had accompanied them to help with the practical demonstrations, set up a small display of bread from various center bakeries around the world. As people broke bread together, cultural barriers seemed to dissolve. "Food speaks its own language," she observed wisely, "just like truth and love." The afternoon sessions focused on how different cultures approach the concept of healing through truth-telling. A Japanese delegate shared their tradition of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold, making the scars part of the beauty. "This is what your centers do with human lives," she said. "You help people turn their broken places into sources of strength and beauty." James presented their educational curriculum, now being adapted for different cultural contexts. "The principles of ethical business and community healing are universal," he explained, "but the expression of these principles must honor local wisdom and traditions." As the conference progressed, something remarkable happened. Delegates began spontaneously sharing their own stories of community transformation. A Brazilian representative described how their adaptation of the program had helped heal divisions in favela communities. An Indian delegate spoke about combining the initiative's principles with traditional village council practices. Rachel watched it all with tears in her eyes, holding her locket where Michael's memory lived. "Your father dreamed of truth healing the world," she whispered to Sarah. "But I don't think even he imagined how far that healing would spread." Sarah touched her own locket, feeling the precious letter inside. "Actually," she replied softly, "I think he did. Remember what he wrote? Truth with love can rebuild worlds. Not just one world, worlds. Maybe he knew that once truth started growing, it wouldn't stop at any border." The day ended with a unanimous commitment to create an international alliance of Michael Harrison Initiative Centers. But rather than a rigid organizational structure, it would be a network of healing gardens, each growing in its own way while sharing roots of wisdom and support. Alexander looked out over the gathered delegates, people from different cultures, speaking different languages, yet all connected by the simple power of truth told with love. "This is real globalization," he said to his family. "Not the kind that builds empires of power, but the kind that grows gardens of hope." As evening fell over the UN building, Sarah stood at the window, watching the city lights below. In her mind's eye, she could see similar lights coming on in cities around the world, each one marking a place where truth was being spoken, where healing was happening, where love was rebuilding worlds in countless unique and beautiful ways. On the evening before the 5th anniversary of the first center's opening, the family gathered in Sarah's original rooftop garden. The space had grown into a magnificent sanctuary, each plant and pathway telling part of their story. The city spread out below them, dotted with lights from the many centers and renewed communities that had blossomed from their work. Sarah, now a poised young woman of 15, moved through the garden with practiced care, checking on her beloved plants. She paused at a special section where she grew flowers similar to those that had once bloomed in the garden where Michael had proposed to Rachel. "Sometimes I wonder," she said, touching a delicate petal, "if Dad somehow knew all this would happen. His letter seems to speak to everything we've done, everything we're still doing." Rachel joined her daughter, both of them wearing their matching lockets. "Your father believed in the power of truth to outlive lies, of love to overcome fear, but I think even he would be amazed by how you've helped bring that belief to life." Alexander watched them from a bench where he sat with Mrs. Reynolds, both of them enjoying cups of her signature hot chocolate. The years had softened his corporate edges, replacing business acumen with wisdom, ambition with purpose. "Do you remember that rainy night?" Mrs. Reynolds asked him softly. "When you brought home a shivering girl who wouldn't stop cleaning?" "I thought I was helping her," Alexander smiled. "I had no idea she would end up helping all of us find our way back to what really matters." Elena and James arrived with the latest reports from the International Alliance. Centers had now opened in 50 countries, each adapting the core principles to their own cultural needs while maintaining the essential focus on truth, healing, and community. "The Martinez model has gone global," Elena announced proudly. "Traditional, family businesses are being revived in communities from Morocco to Malaysia. Each one becomes a catalyst for local renewal." Mrs. Martinez herself appeared with a special anniversary bread, a recipe that combined traditional elements from centers around the world. As they shared the bread, they shared memories of their journey. "Remember when we thought success meant bigger profits?" James mused. "Now we measure it in restored lives, renewed communities, rebuilt dreams." Sarah spread out her latest garden designs, plans for healing spaces that would be adapted for different climates and cultures. "Every center grows its own way," she explained, "but the roots are all connected, just like us." Rachel touched her locket, feeling the weight of years and memories. "Michael used to say that truth needs witnesses to grow strong. Look how many witnesses we have now, how many stories being told, how many lives being transformed." The conversation turned to future plans. The educational program was expanding to include youth leadership initiatives. New partnerships were forming with international development organizations. The research center in the old bank building was documenting their model for future generations. "But we never forget where it all started," Sarah said firmly. "Every new center begins the same way, with one truth that needs telling, one heart that needs healing, one story that needs to be witnessed with love." As night fell, they gathered around a small fire pit Sarah had designed for evening gatherings. The flames cast dancing shadows on their faces as they shared their hopes for the future. "The world is still full of people cleaning alleys at night," Sarah said softly. "Still full of families holding on to faded photographs and lost dreams. Our work is really just beginning." Alexander nodded, understanding now what true legacy meant. "It's not about building something permanent," he reflected. "It's about creating spaces where truth can keep growing, where healing can keep happening, where love can keep rebuilding worlds." Mrs. Reynolds brought out a special anniversary cake, decorated with symbols from centers around the world. As they celebrated together, they were joined by video calls from international partners, faces and voices from across the globe, all connected by the simple power of truth told with love. Rachel watched her daughter move among these digital windows, speaking words of encouragement in several languages she'd learned over the years. The scared girl from the alley had become a beacon of hope for others, finding their way out of darkness. "Michael would be so proud," Mrs. Reynolds said, squeezing Rachel's hand. "Not just of what we've built, but of how we've built it. With truth at every step, with love in every action." Sarah returned to the garden's edge, looking out over the city she'd helped transform. In her hand, she held her father's letter, its words now known by heart, but still precious on paper. "You know what I've learned," she said to her family. "Truth isn't just about revealing what was hidden. It's about creating something new from what was broken, and love isn't just about healing what was hurt. It's about growing something beautiful from what remains. As they sat together under the stars surrounded by the garden Sarah had grown from hope and healing, they felt the truth of their journey deep in their hearts. They had done more than rebuild worlds. They had shown how truth and love could create new ones again and again in endless, beautiful ways. In the soft light of dawn, Sarah walked through her newest garden creation, a special installation at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The space had been designed to represent the global reach of the Michael Harrison Initiative, with plants and symbols from every country where centers had taken root. At 16, she had grown into a young woman whose quiet strength reminded everyone of both her parents, Michael's unwavering commitment to truth and Rachel's boundless capacity for love. Today marked a special occasion, the official launch of the Global Truth and Healing Foundation, an organization that would ensure their work continued for generations to come. "Ready, sweetheart?" Rachel appeared beside her, both of them wearing their treasured lockets. The years had given Rachel's beauty a deeper dimension, marked by the wisdom that comes from turning pain into purpose. Alexander joined them, no longer the isolated business titan, but a man whose wealth now measured itself in transformed lives. "The first guests are arriving," he said softly. The garden filled with people from around the world, representatives from every center, families whose lives had been changed, young leaders who had embraced the initiative's principles. Mrs. Martinez and her family had flown in from their latest bakery opening in Tokyo. Elena and James arrived with a new group of scholarship recipients, each carrying Michael's vision forward in their own way. Mrs. Reynolds, moving more slowly now, but still radiating warmth, supervised the arrangement of bread and flowers from centers worldwide. Each item told a story of renewal, of hope reborn, of truth setting people free. Sarah took her place at the podium, Michael's letter close to her heart. Looking out at the gathered faces, she saw not just an audience, but a family that had grown, beyond anything they could have imagined, that rainy night in the alley. "6 years ago," she began, "I was a girl who thought cleaning streets was the only way to prove my worth. Today I stand before you as a witness to what can happen when truth meets love, when healing becomes a shared journey, when one story opens the door for countless others." She shared their journey, not just the triumphs, but the challenges they'd faced and overcome. How each obstacle had taught them new ways of growing, new paths to healing, new definitions of success. "My father wrote that truth, with love, can rebuild worlds," she continued. "What we've discovered is that these rebuilt worlds become gardens where new truth can grow, where new healing can take root, where new love can blossom." The presentation screens showed images from centers around the globe, the restored furniture, district in Boston that had inspired similar revivals in European cities, the Martinez Bakery network that had reconnected displaced communities across continents, the educational programs that were nurturing a new generation of ethical leaders. Rachel spoke about the power of witnessed truth to heal not just individuals but entire communities. Alexander shared how their model of ethical business had begun to influence corporate practices worldwide. Elena and James presented data showing the initiative's growing impact, millions of lives touched, thousands of communities transformed. But it was the personal stories that moved everyone most deeply. A young girl from Kenya described how her family's traditional weaving business, restored through the initiative, had helped heal decades of community conflict. A scholarship recipient from Brazil shared how the program had helped him transform his neighborhood story from one of loss to one of renewal. Mrs. Reynolds, who had become known as the grandmother of the movement, spoke about the importance of keeping heart at the center of their expanding work. "Every number in our reports represents a story," she reminded them. "Every policy we create must serve the truth of human experience." As the day progressed, Sarah led tours through the symbolic garden, explaining how each element represented part of their journey. The Martinez family's section featured herbs used in their traditional recipes. The Boston Craftsman's area showcased indigenous woods from communities they'd helped revive. Every plant, every path held meaning. "This garden will grow with us," Sarah explained, As new centers open, as new stories join our family, we'll add their symbols here. It's a living testament to the power of truth and love to keep rebuilding worlds. The celebration culminated with a ceremony that touched everyone's hearts. Representatives from each center added soil from their communities to a special planting bed. In it, Sarah placed a seedling grown from the first plant she'd tended in her original rooftop garden. Like truth, she said, this plant will take root in soil made rich by many stories. Like love, it will grow in strength by drawing from many sources. And like healing, it will create space for new life to flourish. As evening fell, the garden glowed with soft lights, each one representing a center somewhere in the world where truth was being spoken, where healing was happening, where love was rebuilding lives. Rachel held her daughter close, both of them feeling Michael's presence in the gentle breeze that stirred the garden's leaves. "Your father once told me," she said softly, "that the most powerful truth is the one that keeps growing, that keeps helping others find their way home." Sarah touched her locket, where his letter had guided their journey from that first rainy night to this moment of global celebration. "And the most powerful love," she added, "is the one that turns cleaning streets into growing gardens, that turns hiding places into healing spaces, that turns one family's truth into hope for the whole world." As the stars appeared above their garden of global healing, the gathered family, blood relations and chosen allies alike, shared one final bread-breaking ceremony. In this simple act of communion, they celebrated not just what they had built, but what continued to grow, a legacy of truth that would keep speaking, of love that would keep healing, of hope that would keep rebuilding worlds for generations to come. For in the end, they had discovered what Michael Harrison had known all along, that when truth finds fertile ground in love, it grows into something greater than any empire of power. It grows into gardens of endless possibility, where every story matters, where every heart can heal, where every world can be rebuilt again and again in endless beautiful ways.